Yes, ma'am. I'll call the order of this meeting of the Board of Commissioners for the Town of Pittsburgh for Monday, the 13th, elected 13th of February, 2017. And as for the position, we'll start with the moment of silence. Thank you. Jay Carroll, would you lead us in the pledge?
Would everyone rise for the pledge? Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
Thank you. You have before you your agenda for the evening. The consent agenda, I can ask to pull number 4 under the consent agenda. Staff needs a little bit longer to work on that capital project budget for the East Sidewalk extension. So we will eliminate that item. Is there any other amendment to the consent agenda?
For item number 2, reappointment of ABC board member Jim Mask. We also need or have the opportunity to appoint him again as chairman, and we can either add that to this consent item or pull it and discuss it.
So we appoint the chair of that board and not the board itself.
Correct. And I think, well, I won't speak for any other members of that board, but
I'd be in favor of that.
So we'll amend number 2 under the consent agenda to include that he not only be reappointed but also appointed as chair.
yes. And then I would like to pull item 3, just because I've got some technical questions, make sure I understand the whole process on that application, and suggest we make that new business number 1.
Any other amendments to the consent agenda? Is there a motion to approve it as amended?
So moved.
Moved by Michael Fiat, seconded by Pamela Balzer. Those in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, motion carries unanimously. The next thing on the agenda are public hearings, the first of which is an annexation request. Excuse me, we need a motion for the regular agenda. So, would the regular agenda be approved by the board with the addition of the matter from the consent agenda coming over as item 1 for the new business?
So moved.
Second.
Moved by Michael Fiocco, seconded by Jay Farrell. Those in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Thank you. Those opposed. Thank you. Now the public hearings. Thank you, Jeff Jones. The first is an annexation request for 120 Oakwood Drive.
Thank you, Board. I don't have a whole lot of slides for us tonight because we've had some issues with getting the actual meets and bounds for the annexation for us to be able to certify, for Alice to be able to actually certify the annexation. So what I would like for you to do is to open the public hearing and to continue it to the 27th. We will have a fuller discussion on the 27th about the annexation. The applicant is well aware of what's happening tonight. They're okay with that, and they're going. The issue of the annexation, as I mentioned in the memo, was one, they were building a home in Pittsburgh, just right outside the town limits on Oakwood Drive, and they wanted water and sewer from the town. Y'all gave her allocation a meeting ago, and annexation is just following through with the town policy on having them annex in the town with both water and sewer. We'll have a full discussion at the 27th meeting if you desire to open the public hearing and continue to the 27th.
Do I hear a motion to open the public hearing?
So moved.
Moved by Pamela Balzer, seconded by Michael Fiocco. Those in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, motion carries. Then Is there a motion to continue the hearing until the 27th of February?
So moved. Second.
Moved by Pamela Walden, seconded by John Bonnet. Those in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Thank you. Thank you very much. The next is a rezoning request, and Victoria Bailiff will lead us to the point where we need a motion for another public hearing.
This is a public hearing for rezoning RAZ-2017-01, the Oldham rezoning. Graham and Mary Oldham have proposed to rezone 2985 U.S. Highway 15501 North from RA2 Residential Agriculture to C2 Highway Commercial. The parcel is approximately 0.62 acres. It has been zoned RA2 since the late 1980s and previously housed base hits, a indoor batting cage. The parking lot currently in place straddles the western property line. The adjoining property owner will no longer be allowing the Grahams to use her portion of the parking lot, and the Grahams are aware that the parking and buffer requirements of any future use must be met without the benefits of any parking availabilities on the adjoining lot. The future land use plan has designated this property for medium density residential, and the surrounding properties are currently zoned RA2 to the north and east, and to the west RA5, and to the south the mix of RA2 and PDD. Although the proposed amendment is inconsistent with the future land use plan, staff has recommended approval as the property is positioned on U.S. Highway 15501, a major arterial, and is close in proximity to other properties which are commercial in nature. Staff finds this location to be suitable for C2 Highway Commercial. The Planning Board considered this rezoning at their meeting on February 6th, and they too found the proposed amendment to be inconsistent with the future land use plan, but recommended to approve in a vote of 5-0.
I don't think actually that we need a further motion on the public hearing since we're still operating under the one we did previously. At this point, we have two speakers signed up for the public hearing, Wade Barber and Patrick Bradshaw.
It may be appropriate for Mr. Bradshaw to go first since he represents the property owner, or I'll be back at first.
Thank you.
Madam Mayor and Commissioners, I'm Patrick Bradshaw here tonight to represent Scott and Mary Oldham, the applicants in this rezoning request. I would just, first of all, like to agree with the planning staff and the planning board's conclusions that this is an appropriate location for commercial zoning. This property itself has been used for commercial purposes for going on 15 years. It is very near a number of other properties that are commercial, either by zoning or by actual use over a long period of time. It's on a major highway artery, obviously, which is the zoning say is an appropriate location for C2 zoning. There will be no harm to the public interest. There shouldn't be any change in impact on the public because the building is already in existence. I don't want to try to anticipate what Judge Barber might say, but I did see the letter that he wrote to you all today, and I would just say that, of course, the Oldhams anticipate complying with the requirements of the zoning ordinance if the property is rezoned, and they do not anticipate using Annette Robertson's property for parking or for any other purpose. So I will take my seat and we'll hear from Judge Barber, I suppose, and if you have any questions for me, I'll be glad to come back up.
Thank you. Patrick Bradshaw. Wade Barber.
Thank you. In order to make our position clear, I represent Annette Robertson, who owns 12 acres, almost 13 acres, that adjoins this property, this 0.62 acres of property. And just as importantly, they share the common entrance to 15501. So whoever comes into her property will be partly on this property that's be zoned commercial. Mr. Bradshaw said 15 years ago, her brother built this building. There was a problem at the time with his getting a CO2 certificate of occupancy, which we won't go into. But in order to accommodate him for his business, which was to put in a baseball practice building, base hits it's called, she agreed that they could park on her property. She has no opposition to the rezoning, but she is concerned that this is the gateway of her property, and with a general C2 designation, a lot of different things can go there. Metal fabricating facilities, garages, car repair places, lots of things that would detract from her property. She anticipates that just as it's appropriate to rezone his commercial, in a few years it may be well appropriate to zone her 12 acres commercial, or make high-end dense residential on her property, or a lot of uses that if the town doesn't carefully control what goes on there, then it could detract from the value of her property. And so, as I have letters here for you, I wanted to be very clear about what her position was. Have y'all seen that? Okay. I'm sorry. Let me hand out copies if I may.
Thank you.
So the bottom line is that she doesn't oppose it, but she does hope that the town will enforce the setback, landscaping, site plan, all those kind of restrictions that we have on the property to minimize the adverse impact on her property. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll be glad to respond to any questions.
Are there any questions from the board?
I have one, just a little clarification. The applicant does also live down that back road. Is that correct?
That is correct, Commissioner.
Okay.
Is the use presently, is the building that was housing the business for base hits, was that use allowed?
It had a special use permit in previous years.
Is it in compliance with the conditions of that special use permit?
There are a few that they did not comply with throughout the years. They did trim the landscaping on the front. It was intended to be taller landscaping, but they've kept it trimmed down. Looks nice, but it's trimmed. And they also were required to record a lease agreement of the parking lot. That was not done. And I believe also the lot was supposed to be larger than it currently is. That was
So the
recorded.
required parking relied upon an agreement with the neighbor?
It was supposed to be recorded, but it never was. And the plat that was drawn up by a surveyor was never recorded.
I think I've heard that it's gone out of business, or business no longer operating. Is it considered vacant at this time?
I would, yeah, I would guess that. Yeah.
So its present use is vacant.
Yes.
And therefore, any use that wants to re-engage or engage will require a site plan to be approved. Is that correct? No.
No, we wouldn't get into a site plan at this stage because they wouldn't be, unless they were adding on to the building. there wouldn't be a site plan needed. The building as positioned is closer to the street than what would have been allowed in that zoning district. There was a variance granted by the town. So that was through that special use permit or process that was granted. I don't envision a new site plan coming in. What I do envision is a upfit permit to come in, and that we have met with the applicant, the property owner, and their understanding what we would be looking for with that permit. That all parking spaces for the new use would be located on his property, and that any screening or buffering that's required between a C2 zone property, in anticipation of this being zone C2, and any residential property would most likely be an opaque screen, and he would have to put that in. And we talked about ways for him to do that, all landscaping or fencing and some landscaping along that western property line.
Is that, so I'm thinking that the way that would be communicated and the way it would be established as a requirement on that property would be through the site plan process, not necessarily that it comes to this board, because administrative review can occur on site plan. Because
well, there would need to be a plan for the landscaping for sure.
Yeah.
So I think we're thinking down the same path, but maybe not the full set of plans that we would normally get and the review time. But we would definitely need plans that show landscaping, and then if there was any needed parking spaces that's not on the subject property, and they needed to add some spaces, then we would get into that on a plan that staff would review.
So to get the upfit permit with the county, would be looking at building, from building inspection perspective, would be looking for zoning compliance acknowledgement.
That's right.
Yeah. And the town would not provide that, or would provide it only after finding that
That's right.
it is in compliance with the zoning requirements.
The anticipated planting that they have on the plan and any additional parking, we review that. It looks acceptable. We would issue the zoning compliance. We would then go to the county for permits. Once a CO is ready to be had, be called into the county, we would then go out and do an inspection to make sure that those improvements are completed. And then we would tell the county, yes, they've done the improvements that we're requesting. Yeah, there's a little sequence.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
What about the setbacks? Victoria, you had said that it didn't originally comply with setbacks. Will it comply with setbacks now?
No, I don't think so. I think it's about 18 feet
Too close to the road?
To the road. So it's, I want to say that the front setback in C2 is 50 still. So even the change in zoning is still going to have that issue. However, it appears through the record there was some sort of variance given by the town that says this is an acceptable location for this building.
So granted, that variance would apply both to the conditional use permit and to the C2?
I would think that it would go forward with that.
That's your understanding, Mr. Gretchen?
That is my understanding as far as the variance, Madam Mayor, but I think, and I can be corrected if I'm wrong, I think the setback in C2 is actually 25. So
and I'm thinking 25 as well.
Yeah.
And a major transportation corridor.
Yeah.
So that makes it 50.
Yeah.
Okay. So I just wanted to acknowledge for the record that my client understands the things that the planners have had to say here. They're prepared to comply with the landscaping requirements that are in the ordinance. My understanding is that most or all of the planting that was in the special use permit was put in, but it's been inappropriately pruned over the years. But regardless, they're prepared going forward to comply with all of those requirements, and they understand that any required parking will have to be on property that they own and not on Ms. Robertson's property.
That western side is paved all the way up to the road.
It is.
On the private road.
It is.
And so, in order to construct buffer, they'd have to pull up the pavement or drill through it.
Right. We talked about that last week when we talked with the applicant, how they would have to cut out sections for fence posts. They wanted to do that and south section for landscaping shrubbery. Because if you do an opaque fence, your landscaping goes way down on what you're required to put in. Because the fence counts for a lot of that screen that you would eventually get with mature landscaping. So yes, we talked about that. And I anticipate with the cutting and installing of a fence or landscape, that some of those spaces that this bisects may not qualify for 9 by 18 spaces that the ordinance asks for. So that's why I'm thinking if a use that needs a number of parking spaces, then there will need to be some parking located elsewhere on the property.
They will have to acquire that.
Well, he owns lots of property adjacent to this. He owns enough property adjacent to this to make that work.
Okay, but it's back behind the building.
It's to the side and to the rear of this building, sort of towards the north area. Oh.
Towards beautiful.
So,
This property to the north.
oh, yeah, okay. Well, and I seem to recall from, Michael, I don't want to interrupt your line of inquiry if you recall from the planning board, the kind of conclusion was that to some extent some of these things are factors that are kind of outside of the control of that board and possibly this board as well. Could you help elaborate?
What things are we thinking?
I got the impression that planning board kind of concluded, well, this is like another situation where it's clearly suboptimal, but we're going to have to leave it up to the landowners to figure out how to work within the bounds of the policy.
Right, and that's where the discussion with the applicant came about last week after the planning board meeting, was to be reassured as staff that the applicant understood that if you move forward with this rezoning, this is what's going to need to happen with your property. Those types of things are outside of that private issue with the parking lot. Really is outside of the town's purview. We're just required to make sure that there's parking for the use, and now parking on this particular piece of property that is owned by the applicant. In the past, they had this agreement. However, it was obtained. There was an agreement, a signed agreement, that was not final. So.
Well, I don't know if this goes to the merits or demerits of the question in front of us right now, but I guess I'd like to clarify a little bit because some information was presented regarding the prior special use, the grant of the special use. I think I heard that there were many concessions granted. And Victoria, you listed some of those. But were any of those concessions actually delivered for the requirements?
Yeah, so the landscaping was definitely a requirement of the board at the time when the approval was made. And that landscaping was put into place as planned. Right. Over the years, Burford hollies that were planted along 15501 are supposed to grow to a 10 to 12 foot height. They were pruned and kept to a lower height. Applicants and understanding that the ordinance requires that type of screening, that type of landscaping to mature height of 10 to 12 feet. On the property, adjoining property owner's side of the parking lot, there was a plan to put wax myrtles in, and that happened as well. So there were some improvements on the adjacent properties that was done.
But
and there was another requirement to get a commercial driveway permit. DOT came back and said that they did not need a commercial driveway permit because the actual entrance is off Golden Place and not 15501. So that was a moot point. That was a moot condition.
But it won't be in a new plan, will it?
They're not doing anything to the driveway.
Do they have access?
Yeah.
Robertson?
I've asked that of her attorney, and they have not contended that there's a problem with access.
Okay. But there is no formal documentation of the prior arrangement, the lease agreement?
It's not it's a signed document, but it's not recorded on the registry.
Okay. And it was required to be larger than it was as delivered.
Right. So there was some discussion at the board that, well, it's on RA2. Can we get rid of this nonconformity of the smaller lot and make it a 2-acre lot? And it appears that there was some direction on that. Applicant hired a surveyor, went through the motions of having the surveyor do the work, and we have a plat, but it was just never recorded. So I'm not sure what happened with that.
Well, Jeff, I'll just cut to the chase. Do you and staff have the mechanisms necessary within your control and purview to ensure that ordinances are complied with any additional changes or future use?
I would think if we're aware of any issues or any conditions that have been placed on properties, we're going to be able to handle those. This was totally, staff was just unaware of.
Sure.
Yeah.
Right.
And doesn't even appear that maybe even prior staff before we arrived even touched this document, this project either. I mean, it goes back several generations of planners. And it's one of these things that nobody was complaining, and it didn't come up. A lot of the things that we would work on is complaint-based. We'll go out and we'll research, we'll pull the plans. Thank goodness we do have plans. I mean, that's a big thing for us to be able to go and pull 2 files on this project and be able to go through the history. That helps us establish our presentations tonight.
Are there further questions?
I have one, Judge Barber. Judge Barber, you say that your client is not opposed to the rezoning.
That's correct, Your Honor.
And then I guess the question is the kind of the information discovery that's occurred as a result of this exchange. Is that satisfactory? If the rezoning proceeds, if we approve the rezoning, is that satisfactory?
May I clarify a couple of things? One is, I don't want it to appear that Ms. Robinson has come in and agreed to something, perhaps reneged on anything she formerly agreed to. The circumstances in 2003, 2004 was that her brother had built this building for a batting cage. And when he wanted to open, the town said no, and they came in and agreed to special conditions so that he could get his permit to open and engage in his business, which was the batting cage, and filed with the county. Is the building with the batting cage laid out in there? It was a very specific thing. And so what she was agreeing to at that time was for an indefinite period of time, for no consideration, she gave her brother permission to park on her land. And so, but going from there to him no longer operating it, being general commercial, is a big step. So that's why she said, he's using my parking area, it was just a special situation. Secondly, with regard to what happened after that and whether she objected or not, he put the screening between the parking lot and her land in place. But the other conditions the county put on were numerous. There was a lot of correspondence from David Monroe to them about not complying. And I think the last thing in that old file is that there's something from the surveyor saying, hands off, I'm not doing any more to the town. And something from David Monroe saying, I want to go after the bond or something. And nothing else was ever done. But she didn't have any complaints. I mean, she wasn't going to go after the brother saying, you are old. She wasn't meaning to get in there on top of the brother on that. But if the town can enforce its setbacks and landscape requirements, whether or not they come in for a building permit. And it was my impression that if they're going to change the use, they would have to come to the town. But if they can go in there and put in a junk repair shop on this property, and if you don't go for a building permit, then she has problems with it. But if it's going to be, if the town's going to have control to enforce its existing ordinance on this property, then she has no objection.
Thank you for that clarification. And Mr. Jones, I think I heard you say that if you were made aware of it, you will have ability to enforce. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah. Okay. We're talking about landscaping that's in that will just needs not to be pruned, and then any new landscaping along boundary of property lines and residential zone.
So Judge Barber, I'm just curious, just to clarify, the existing building, your client is okay with that building staying there? You're not suggesting that they would have to change that setback?
No, she doesn't want to mess up this business use of that. She just wants to. This product she owns. This is her land right here, and so this is really frontage, park frontage on her land. This is her entrance right here. So without she don't want to put him out of business. She just wants the town to do what it needs to do to minimize any adverse impact on her property.
I guess I have a question. You know, the best way to stop an unattractive use would be to continue with the conditional use zoning rather than C2 zoning. So I guess in a way I'm wondering if the concerns that you, Wade Barber, are expressing on behalf of Annette Robertson about the neighboring property, if those would be easier to handle if this was a conditional use rather than C2 zoning. Do either Jeff Jones or Wade Barber have a thought about that?
We're speculating on what potential adverse uses could be there. I don't know what that could be. And it could be that the use is totally enclosed in the building and no one's aware of anything really going on there. We do have ordinances, landscaping, buffering ordinances that will need to be adhered to. We understand the position of the property owner, the adjacent property owner, so this is one that we'll have to stay on top of. I understand that any type of new business that would go in there, regardless, would need some sort of, at a minimum, life safety inspection from the county, and they would have to pull a permit to have that fire marshal come out or something to do life safety. Those would trigger, or should trigger, a permit from the town. Now, are there instances where the county does not tell the town and upfit permits go in place? You're right about that. You would be right. But we're working through that communication issue with the county, and I am trying my best to get that better. Sometimes they don't defer to the town as much as they should on matters of inspections and permits, but we'll get better at that.
Well, I just want to make sure, and I'll recognize you in a moment, Patrick Bradshaw. I just want to make sure that this board won't be asked to grant another variance for one reason or another. Obviously, this building cannot be moved.
Right.
But you know, it makes it a different. It gives it a different flavor when variances are asked for, especially in a situation like this, which I understand was more of a forgiveness than permission kind of a transaction to begin with. Patrick Bradshaw, did you wish to speak to that?
Mayor, I just wanted to respond to a particular question that you asked at the beginning of that about the landscaping requirements under a special use permit as opposed to the buffer requirements under the zoning ordinance with the C2 zoning.
Actually, I'm more worried about the setback than the landscape, and just control in general.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think with regard to the setback, that is an existing situation. The variance was granted, the building is built, and the property line is where it is. So I don't think that's going to be changing. I think that the landscaping requirements in the zoning ordinance are just as extensive as the requirements that were in the special use permit. I don't think the special use permit supplemented that. And as Jeff has said, if the processes work, I think that there will be opportunity for the town to have to issue a zoning compliance certificate before uses can be put in place in this property. I also suspect that there are nearby neighbors who, by the way, share my client's 60-foot wide access road that leads to his home as well as to this business use. I think there will be other folks who will be paying attention as well.
Are there any further questions from the board? Then I'd entertain a motion to go out of public hearing.
So moved.
Second?
Moved by Michael Fiocco, seconded by Bette Wilson Foley. Those in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed. We have next citizens matters. We don't have anyone signed up for speaking this evening. Is there anybody in the room, however, that wished to sign up that did not do so? Hearing none, we'll move next then to Commissioner updates. I wanted to speak for a moment about this is usually a period of time in which I talk about the number of meetings that I've been to over the last period of time since our last meeting. And this time there were quite a few, but one of the most interesting meetings was a League of Municipality meeting, which was held in Raleigh, and just so happened that I sat at the table with mayors that had water treatment issues up and down the Haw River. And so we had a very interesting lunch, and later arranged a conference call on February the 6th, which consisted of mayors and utility chairs from Fayetteville, Pittsburgh, Burlington, and Greensboro, and two members of the North Carolina Department of Water Quality, and had a really fascinating discussion about the existing 1,4-dioxane in the Fall River water. And I sent a long email to the board, I believe, but the essence is that the State Department is very interested in working with us to try to clear this chemical, which is a suspected carcinogen, from our drinking water source. And they are very dedicated to the idea of working in the context of establishing limits and monitoring in the Haw River. We're the first one drinking from the Haw River downstream from what they believe are the dischargers who were creating this 1,4-dioxane. And so we have the first level of monitoring and responsibility to make sure that those people upstream understand how important it is that we have clean and good drinking water. So this is a continuing conversation, and it was just really wonderful to hear the kind of support that we're going to have from the state water resources people. And we finally got to the right people in this big bureaucracy, and it was just a real wonderful thing to have at least a minimal amount of progress on this. Also attended a meeting at Habitat and the Economic Development Commission. Had a joint board meeting this past week with the joint boards of EDC. And then the fun part, I spoke to my grandson's school in Wake County about what it was like to be the mayor of Pittsburgh, and yesterday cut cake at the Council on Aging Cake Bake-Off. So there are some really stunning things about being the mayor of Fitzgerald and eating lots of chocolate cake and talking to small children are two options. Do board members have any updates on fairgrounds or PBA or Triangle J Council of Governments?
Before we move on, I just want to express gratitude for the work you've done on the Hall River issue. So I really appreciate all the work you've done.
I know Brian has an update in his updates, but I'll just mention again that the 28th of February this month, a couple of weeks, there will be a presentation and a meeting available to all to come see. The Main Street program, there will be a request, a solicitation from volunteers to get involved. There's lots of things going on in the Main Street program. We'd love to have all of you or any of you come join us and pitch in. And you'll also have an opportunity to see and ask questions of the designers and NCDOT of the first 4 projects listed in the Downtown Vision Plan that was adopted, I think, about a year and a half, 2 years ago. And so some of the funds that the DOT has committed to the town of Fitzborough are being gathered to be expended on these projects, and they're substantial projects. And 90% construction drawings have been submitted, design drawings, and so please come out and ask any questions that you have about the designers and the NCDOT. What time is that? At 6:30, and it's at the Roadhouse. So they've got a very large room that can accommodate probably over 100 people.
Deborah Baldwin, are you working on the Triangle J on the affordable housing?
Yes, but we really don't have the next update for that yet. So it's ongoing.
And nothing to report from the County Climate Change Advisory Committee.
Then we're ready then for new business. We have moved item number 3, the seafood sewer application. Yeah, I'm trying to be careful. The seafood restaurant sewer allocation request.
Okay. Well, my question is this. We've been really careful in the last several years in allocating this very scarce resource that we have to avoid situations where it is granted to somebody who doesn't use it. And so we want to preserve folks who are ready to use it. And the way we've done that in the past is through the site plan process, basically required a user to submit a site plan within a year of allocation. And it usually takes 4 to 6 months to get a site plan approved. And then we've also had the requirement to be valid only as long as the site plan was valid. And so this language is different, and I just wanted to better understand what safeguards there were for sunsetting this if it's not used. And it makes mention of the allocation running with the effective zone compliance certification. And I think that language is chosen because there's not a site plan requirement, just a building operating requirement. Right? So, what is the period of validity for a zone compliance certification?
I would say 12 months.
It is
4 years. Yeah.
So this language will basically emulate what we've been trying to do. And okay, so then I'm comfortable with this as is. Because I think we really need to be careful to make sure. I mean, because that's 5% of the remainder. We want to make sure it's going to be used for growth.
Are there further questions regarding this issue?
No, but I just want to thank Commissioner Fiocco for that detail and confirmation. That's very helpful.
In that event, Mr. Fiocco, would you like to make the motion to approve that agenda item?
I would like to do that motion. Second.
Moved by Michael Fiocco, seconded by John Zonis. Those in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, motion carries unanimously. Then we're at new business request for hotel incentives. And Kirk Bradley and Paul Touchstone believe that you're here to speak on those incentives.
Good evening, Madam Mayor. Thank you for the opportunity, Commissioners, to address you tonight. And should I advance it? Okay. We thought it'd be important. Kyle's going to speak more specifically to the incentive request, which we've already gone through the county, and they've approved these. But we thought it might be important, even though some of you were able to participate and come to our charrette back in September, to maybe provide a little context as to where these hotel would be located, potential hotel, and then also bring you up to speed with some of the conversations we've been having with town staff as to when we're going to get started. So, first, just to make sure everybody's aware, we are, my partner and I, John Hugo, were here probably 10 months ago to talk to you and introduce ourselves as the principals of EchoCP Partners, working with Chatham Park investors to work on the commercial areas in the North Chatham Village, up the intersection of 15501 and Russet Run. And in September, we had a charrette to try and focus on two really important concept of placemaking. Having something this new and big, we wanted to have a project that would create an exciting place to attract both current and future residents of Chatham County and Pittsburgh, and hopefully people from out of the areas. As you may recall, we talked about we wanted to have something that would be exciting enough that people, instead of driving north to Chapel Hill and Durham or east to Apex and Cary, would go west or south. So that's what we've been working on. During the charrette, we had a lot of great input from stakeholders across the city, the town, and the county, and there were probably 7 key learnings, and I want to repeat those here tonight. First, we wanted to provide a complimentary experience to downtown. Second, we wanted to provide Chatham County residents an alternative to driving out of the county for services, which I just mentioned. Third, we want to create a pedestrian-friendly environment. Fourth, we want to connect new places to Pittsburgh through trails and shared open space. Fourth, we wanted to respect the history and context of Pittsburgh. Embrace the local character, artsy and quirky. Ms. Mayor, I think that was your term, and we tried to strive to do that. And lastly, we want to create an opportunity for local businesses. So, just to give you a little regional context, here's sort of my view of what the triangle looks like. It's not the Triangle J map, and there's some other counties in there, but it certainly gives you a regional context of where Chatham and Pittsburgh are located. The sort of sub-slide is the PDD of Chatham Park. And lastly, it's kind of a 350-acre area of focus that the charrette looked at in terms of road connectivity, the residential, and our initial project, which will be on 44 acres just north of the Bojangles. That's what this map shows. We wanted to have something that would create a real urbanized feel and connect into the existing road network, Freedom Parkway, Russet Run, and provide a mixed-use cluster concept where we have live, work, and play exemplified in one concise area. So we will have residential units as well as office and retail. We've done a lot of work since our charrette in September. Now that we actually go from the idea of just visioning it into trying to put it on a upside-down bowl with a crown piece of land and create something that allows people pedestrian-friendly walking. So we're very focused on grades and tying into the fixed points of the traffic circle at Freedom Parkway and 15501. So this is our plan. I've got a couple of views that I think will probably make it a little bit more interesting. The first is kind of a stylized view from 15501. I think the main thing I'd like to point out here is just to see a little bit more urban intensity than you would do at even Southern Village. We've got 4-story plus structures. There is one building, the Veranillo Senior Living, that will be 6 stories, and we'll go down to 1-story buildings. So there'll be a mix of heights and uses, primarily along 2 axes, Freedom Parkway and the main entrance into this project, which is north of the Russet Run driveway. Bojangles, does this have a pointer on?
It's not. You're better off using your finger.
Okay. That's Bojangles. This is Russet Run. This is the main entryway here, and this is Freedom Parkway coming down. That's the hospice building there, and the existing buildings are up here. This is the Cleveland Place project right there. It's another view that they had, that they did during the charrette. They did the one I just showed you subsequent. This is a view the other way, and it really highlights the common areas here. And this is about twice as large as the common area at Southern Village. So that was one of the learnings that we had, that we wanted more space to have activities there. A big part of our plan is to have plenty of parks and open space with connectivity, and that's what I want to show you here. We designed in, we got a lot of input on that, and that was, of course, very much in keeping with our vision as well of what we wanted this project to be. Got a couple of images I'd like to show you of what we think the project will look like when completed. This is along the main entryway. So you see you have cafes with outdoor dining, and then the office and apartments above retail on the ground floor. This is a view of an event on the green. Third is this area we're very excited about, and where we really tried to pull in the local flavor and give an opportunity for our artists and farmers, which we think are 2 of the hallmark characteristics of Chatham County and Pittsburgh, a place to be and have and operate within this environment. And we call it the Works Yard. As you can see, it's got farmer market type of display areas, and also we think there'll be space for artists to be able to have affordable types of places to sell and display their wares, and hopefully illustrate their making some type of studios as well. The last picture is a view along Russet Run. You see the Root Cellar building, which is in Penguin Place, and the tall building across the way is the hotel, and it's a 120-key hotel, probably Hampton Inn brand. We have sort of 2 layers that we're operating under. Chatham Park has their own sort of standards that are in the works, as well as the town. So we've been working with both the public staff down in Pittsburgh as well as Chatham Park investors. In the additional elements, one of the key things is the Chatham Park vision statement, which we feel like we have taken to heart in what I've already showed you and what we developed in the charrette. So wanted to make sure that you were aware that we are aware of those additional elements. We're trying to work within them. And then more specifically, 6 points that we wanted to make sure that nature is always present, that we are able to evolve over time, but have authenticity in our architectural structures. We wanted compatibility and creativity, and we want to each area within this project to have a place, one piece at a time. Celebrate nature and social areas, so we will have a lot of landscaping there, and then try and promote creativity in our architectural elements. So I've got a display for the first time publicly here tonight, a couple of initial revised architectural renderings. This is for a building, the one on the left is for a medical building that will be right on 15501 along the main entrance. You see we're trying to incorporate art elements as well as the biophilic design qualities and structures. And we're also looking in our site plan to try and find as many places as possible to develop unique storm drain elements like you see in this upper right corner. We are locating a small market as part of our process, but again, the intent is to bring out art elements within the architecture, and I think this will be indicative, at least the low-rise buildings. We've showed previously some of the high-rise buildings and the architecture we're hoping to bring in. This is an important thing we want to make you aware that our projections for this project is that we need about 174,000 gallons per day of permitted wastewater. So it's a pretty significant project, a lot of square feet, very different uses, and that's not needed day one necessarily in terms of flow, but in terms, I think the actual flow is about 90,000 gallons per day, but the permitted flow based on the types of uses at this point is that amount broken down by parcel and building. Lastly, I think an important element is our timeline. We have had great conversations with the town of Pittsboro staff in tandem with the Chatham Park Investors team. We plan to submit, we hope, in April for this project. We had our pre-meeting last week. And based on an April submittal, Jeff anticipated that we could get site plan approval in June or July. Based on that, we would plan to start earthwork in the fourth quarter of this year, and buildings would start in the second or third quarter of 2018. That would give us occupancy at the earliest fourth quarter 2018, most likely first part of 2019. And we think it would take us about 2 years on a rolling basis of developing various buildings to complete the project at this point. We've had tremendous interest, a lot of great tenants that are interested in being there. We're excited to get the project started, and I'm happy to answer any questions now, Madam Mayor, or if you want to have Kyle do his presentation, and then we can do them simultaneously.
What's the pleasure of the board?
I'm curious, occupancy. What does occupancy mean? The entire 44 acres has been developed and is ready for occupancy?
That would be the initial. First tenants would move in at that point in time. That's what we're saying. In other words, we'd start construction, and then we would get our first COs and have occupancy. And then we expect, based on leasing, we expect to roll through the project over a 24-month period. So, we would hope that most of that would be occupied by the time we complete it.
Can I say that you think it's a 24-month construction period for that 44 acres of development you've shown?
At this point, yes.
Do you have further questions? Kyle Touchstone from the PUC.
Good evening, Mayor, Board. Appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight and talk a little bit about the hotel, and really wanted to go over an economic impact analysis that we had done on potential hotel locating in Pittsboro and in Chatham County. This was done by Economic Leadership, which is Ted Abernathy's group, which many of you are familiar with from the EDC strategic plan, and then also their work in the county's comprehensive plan. So really the impact of the hotel is looking at overnight guests, the increased spending, and increased tax revenue for the town. Current hotel is 17 miles away in Chapel Hill, so many of our overnight guests are having to stay elsewhere. We have some B&B options here in town, which are great. I stayed in them and enjoyed my stay there, but then we also have individuals who aren't really B&B type people. So I've discovered this through my research recently. Part of the hotel impact really, when we were looking at this with Chatham County, was on the new agriculture and conference center that the county was building at the time. This will help in attracting multiple day conferences, overnight visitors for conferences, which again increases spending here because they've got to eat somewhere. They sometimes will stop and do a little shopping while they're here, so great for all of our businesses and residents. So the study, I'll briefly talk about the methodology. We looked at a most likely scenario, but we also looked at a high and low. And really, we looked at earnings per worker and sales per worker to estimate initial impacts. And then we separated some one-time impacts such as construction. So the multipliers, really these multipliers are showing the ripple effect of the hotel. Initial would be construction and the actual jobs and sales created by the hotel. Direct would be the first round impact, so the spending that the hotel would do within the supply chain. Indirect would be that second round of activity, so when the supply chain is having to buy from their supply chain. And then induced would be when the workers in those supply chains are out spending their money and continuing to grow our economy. The multipliers for the hotel sector, when you look at sales, earnings, and jobs, the total effect for sales is 1.18. So for every dollar in sales, the multiplier comes out to 1.18. For earnings, for every dollar earned, it's $1.23, and the impact, and then for every job, 0.22 jobs are created elsewhere. The initial impact, so the job impact would be 25 employees, $675,960 in annual sales with an annual or an average wage of $27,038. And then the sales impact, we're looking at about $120 a night for nightly rates, 365 days a year, 110 rooms, and at 70% occupancy, we're at about $3.3 million in annual sales. So how does that lay out for us? Really, it's about $600,000 in additional economic activity here in Pittsboro. The total impact of employees would get us to 31. Total earnings would be about 831, and then the sales at that 3.96 million. But that initial impact of just those 25 jobs gets us to 675 and 3.3. So the sales tax, really the sales tax is what we will see an increase in. And with those multipliers, with direct and indirect, probably about 392,400. And this would be coming back to county and town. So it's an overall look at it. When you look at the sensitivity analysis, again, we did a most likely and then a low and a high. So even with 50% occupancy, sales will still be at about $2.4 million. With high occupancy at 90%, sales would still be around 4.3, and then that tax revenue still in the $300,000 to $500,000 range. So these one-time impacts, which would be the construction, of course, they're going to come in, they'll build the hotel, and about $14 million will be spent to construct the hotel. That could generate almost $100,000 in one-time impacts, and then probably 120 jobs created through the construction phase. So the county, we looked at the county incentive, and their incentive, I know that the town does not have an adopted incentive policy currently, so what we tried to do is look at how the county operated, and so basically they will pay 100% of property taxes to the town. and to the county. But then they would be granted a percentage equal to that amount that they've paid. So about 90% for year 1, 80% for year 2, 75% for years 3 and 4, and then 60% for year 5. This is what it looks like for the county. This is estimated at the $14 million using the county tax rate of 0.6338. The annual tax paid estimated would be right at $88,000. So as you see in year 1, the county will generate the $88,732, but then the incentive amount would be $79,858.80. So therefore, the county really generates right at $8,873 as their revenue. That revenue increases continuing through the next several years, and then by year 6, the incentive ends and it's full revenue to the county. This is what it looks like for the town. If we were to apply this incentive percentage to the town using the town's tax rate, $60,662 would be an estimated annual property tax paid to the town. If we were to apply the 90% grant, that would be $6,067 in revenue for the town. At 80%, $12,133. Continuing through year 5, and then by year 6, it would be the full tax revenue to the town with the end of the incentive. So with that, I know it was a lot of numbers and a lot of information. I will pause and take any questions that you have and can explain in better detail if needed.
Questions for Kyle Touchstone?
With the county's system incentive policy, do they have performance metrics by which the hotel in this case would have to acquire in order to receive the credit?
There is a contract that is entered into by the county and the development group, and as long as and you can basically put the jobs or the investment in as some of the clawbacks, if you will. Ultimately, if they meet those thresholds and then they are current on all of their property taxes, and the way that the county's incentive policy is stated, they cannot be delinquent on any taxes, and so they're to receive that incentive. So ultimately, if they meet those thresholds that are ironed out through the contract, then and then they pay that 100% of their property taxes, then they're eligible for that grant.
And how do they obtain that grant? Is it a one-time refund of a tax, or is it a payment?
It's a payment that is basically done annually. So one payment each year of those amounts. But again, it's after you have received that 100% property taxes.
Is this hotel supposed to be on this 44 acres?
Yes, sir. It was, Mr. Bradley pointed out, I believe in one of those last photos where it showed the root cellar. The hotel was in the background a bit. It would be It's ultimately this building, so it's that first building on the right coming off of the roundabout on Russet Run. And there was another. It's this building.
Now, let's go back to the plan view. So where are we at on that? The previous one. This one, yeah. So that letter D in there is the building just to the lower right of that letter D. Is that right?
This one. It's this one.
Oh, is that one across the street? Okay.
One context we didn't give you is why does a hotel need an incentive? It's not a very typical thing to do, but one of the things we have found in talking to our hospitality partner, first of all, not having a hotel in the eastern part of the county is very difficult to get financing, and their current market studies would tell them to build this hotel more like in 2022 or 2023, and we want them to build it sooner rather than later. We think it's important for the Ag Center and for other elements, and so that was the reason. I should have said that at the outset, but that was the purpose of why we felt an incentive was warranted here.
I'm going to add that I work at Barrington, and we have a number of weddings every weekend, and people stay in Chapel Hill and take buses to Barrington. People for a lot of weddings every week.
We're counting on that.
I got a question. It's kind of new to me, these incentives. What is this going to do to open up other businesses for wanting incentives to come to Chatham Park, Pittsburgh, or whatever? What are we going to get? Are we just limited to hotels? I'm just asking, I don't know.
So ultimately, we have the county has a policy that is a little more unique than most of our surrounding counties. It applies to sorry, can we go back to the so the way that their incentive policy is written is it is for a specific type of company, for job creation, for investments, but they also have a clause that provides for exceptions, and so this definitely fell into an exception. They see the need for it with the Agriculture and Conference Center, the lack of a hotel here in Pittsboro, and the potential for increase in sales tax and tourism dollars for this community. Now, the town of Siler City has an incentive policy that is a base 80%. If you invest a certain amount, you're eligible for 80% grant for the next 5 years. So different towns, different counties do their incentive policies different. I hate to speak, but go ahead.
Well, I did not want to cut you off, but I was getting at maybe the way forward for Commissioner Farrell's question in terms of how you set precedent. Are you worried about setting precedent by agreeing to this incentive policy? And I think, as Kyle indicated, and I think as is stated on this particular slide here, the county, according to my knowledge, looked at this as a one-time exception to their policy. So as you can see, policies aren't set in stone. They have a little bit of flexibility within their policy, which isn't, in fact, a legally binding document anyway. So any business could come in and say, well, what about? I think what they did in this case is they said, okay, because a hotel is badly needed in Pittsboro, we would entertain agreement on this incentive package here. I think the way forward for our board could be a similar approach, in that if you agree with the county's rationale on that, you be very specific as to how and why you're agreeing to this incentive if you choose to go that route. So that then the next time someone comes in and says, we would like an incentive policy for our widget making factory, and you say, well, at the time we agreed that the incentive policy was applicable to a needed hotel, we don't necessarily need a widget factory, and therefore we're not looking at those two projects the same way. So I think you in fact have latitude to do this if you go in this direction.
And that is correct. This is one time only. They will not incentivize another lodging facility, another hotel.
I think as far as the county's policy, they have levels based on criteria that what if they meet certain criteria, they could earn a higher level of incentive. And what they applied here in this case was what the county manager termed the maximum level of incentive.
Right. Through our feasibility studies and such, we found that, and not just with this, but with another that was looking at the area, the numbers were the same. It really needed the assistance to really get off the ground and continue running. And I believe that Echo Group has been working diligently with some outstanding hotel providers to identify the best fit for our community and one that will be here. And really, I think with the Hampton brand, it's also very attractive to visitors. I personally have my parents coming for 10 days, and they're staying with me. So, they are hotel people, but they'll be with me because of the lack of a hotel here.
Mr. Touchstone, I'm curious, or Mr. Bradley, curious about the document, Chatham Park Hotel Operator Commitments. How was that drafted?
So when we approached the county, it was that there were certain stipulation requirements, and we worked with the Ag Center, Center Director of Tourism, Travel and Tourism, County Manager, as to the stipulations that would be important to them over and above. In exchange for any incentive, would you do these things, most of which were more memorializing obvious cooperation that we want to have, but that was how they were drafted. Okay. And we just brought those over with the same provisions.
So those were originated in conversations with the county manager and her staff before it was brought to the board. Is that correct?
Correct. Yes.
Okay. That was my understanding as well, is that the board didn't have anything to offer to change up or down this list of commitments.
That's correct.
I have a lot of thoughts to share, but I don't want to interrupt the flow of questioning if there's others who've got questions.
I have one more before I forget it, if you don't mind. The numbers that you get, the 90%, 80, 75, and on down, the revenue that the county is receiving is considerably more revenue. Why are we staying on those same numbers?
It's because their tax rate is higher. It's still at...
I understand that.
So the towns, this is looking at the town tax rate, and so the revenue starts out small with both, but with that town tax rate, it's at $60,662 a year, and then with the county's tax rate, which is ultimately 20 cents higher, that equals the $88,000.
Okay.
Did I answer your question?
But I guess what I'm trying to say also, the 90 to 80 to 75% on down through year after year, where did these numbers come from? Is that just something that the EDC came up with, or was this a...
My predecessor, Diane Reed, during her time, crafted an incentive policy for the county, and the county adopted those percentages. And so that's where it comes from. This is the county's policy that we were looking at. So I mentioned the town of Siler City. Theirs is just 80%. So for 5 years, they would, grant $70,985 and not do a decreased grant.
Well, I think really it's even more multi-layered than that, the incentive program. In fact, they've got 5 different scenarios where they gauge the economic importance of a particular business industry and how they want to incentivize them. Level 1 is the same years, 70, 60, 50, 40, 30. So the EDC or Chatham County has established a multi-layered incentive portfolio.
Right, and that one is based on the way that, and I'm sorry I should have sent that policy over with these documents, but the way that it's structured, jobs, investment, wages, sustainability features, all of those things go into play and provide a number. So it tallies up. If let's say you have some type of green or sustainability practice, or you're LEED certified, you get a couple of points for it. If you invest so much money, you get a couple of points for it. And so at the end, you take that number and look at the matrix, and it tells you which level it comes out to be, whether it's 1 through 5. For really simplicity's sake, tonight we were looking at, we tried to do a side-by-side of what the county has already committed to with the town. And
they've already agreed to their highest level.
Right. That was
so they think the scores a 90 on their score chart. Yeah.
And again, their policy, I believe, one of their pieces, and this was adopted back in 2010. Whereas the Chatham County Board of Commissioners and the Chatham County Economic Development Corporation reserve the right to consider each project individually and to adjust the incentive package based on current conditions or circumstances. So that and you were talking about some of those requirements that would go into a contract. So the requirements that the county really put in were those things that we added or that we provided concerning the conference center and how it would be the conference center hotel. So that and the one time is where the county really saw the justification and need for an incentive for this hotel.
I just have a question. If the town and county are providing incentives, and part of those incentives is that it provides jobs for local people, will local people be constructing this, or is it going to be done without nothing?
Then step to the side.
I'm just wondering, we're putting money aside, that's listed as one of the multipliers.
Well, it's a pretty complex multi-story building, and I think we always try and look to find. I mean, it'll be up to the hospitality company, not us as the overall developers who they pick. But I'm sure they'll look for local labor. But I'm not sure there's a contractor that does this work based in Pittsburgh. We certainly will look to that.
So Hampton or another hospitality company would build
it would be an
operate?
Hampton is the franchisor. It will be it is a regional hospitality company that would own and operate the lodging facility. And just so you know, in the real estate industry, after hospitals, hotels are the most complex things to build. There's a lot of interaction and life safety issues that have to be put in there. There's a lot of complexity. It's a lot harder to build than it's retail and other we'll certainly encourage them to look at subcontractors in areas where they can hire locally as well.
Thank you for that. I do appreciate that comment. Okay, I agree with that. But basically, my concern also has to deal with this Chatham Park hotel operator commitment for the town of Pittsburgh. That more so looks as if it's based on the Ag Center and basically Chatham County more so than the town of Pittsburgh. So those type of, and that's a good idea, but to me there needs to be other things in reference to the town on this as well. So I can't specifically indicate what, but John, I think, has a couple that he would like to add or be considered for that. But the incentive, that is a good idea because we do need a hotel, that's for sure, in Pittsburgh. I mean, it's something that I've been wanting for quite a while now, since I actually got on the board. So someone's tried to do it, it didn't work, but so forth and so on. So there has to be a way to get this, obtain this hotel in Pittsburgh, because as I said, there is a need. We do need to look at this revenue impact and for Chatham County as well as for the town of Pittsburgh. And I do agree with what Jay was saying as well in reference to it. In comparison to Chatham County, maybe there's things we need to tweak for this, but and definitely things we need to tweak for the other.
Okay.
So I think that Jay, that John, Commissioner Ron.
I would add one more thing to that too, is that I think one of the attractions would be our location with all the highways. Hopefully we would get people traveling on 64 easily could hop over, which brings me to one of the things I want to bring up tonight is getting Pittsburgh on Highway 64 listed as Pittsburgh, not just Carthage and Sanford, especially for having a hotel. It needs to be a Pittsburgh sign here. I know that's not in your jurisdiction, but I don't think that was good for next one.
I have maybe some perspectives that might be tiny little bit helpful. I have a very modest experience in hospitality. Helped manage my parents' bed and breakfast, small business, granted, nothing like the scale of a 100-plus room hotel. However, from that experience and that viewpoint, even then, my parents, myself, and every other innkeeper I've spoken with specifically about this question recognize there's a greater need for more lodging in the county. And there seems to be a blind spot, honestly. It's really strange how folks in Chapel Hill will drive all the way to Raleigh to stay at a hotel rather than driving 20 minutes, 25 minutes to a bed and breakfast in Chatham County. So clearly we need a hotel. And I'm very eager to see that happen. And I don't want my questions, my concerns, my skepticism be misinterpreted in any way. But I put this out to a few people asking for input, and I haven't heard a single positive response. And it's really unsettling. So at a very minimum, I think that we need to I'd like to ask if there's consensus to postpone the proposed hearing date a full month, because I really think we need to get more clarity and deeper understanding. Plus, it sounds like we might need to do a little bit of homework to line it up a little bit better. I'm not sure, but I thought the town tax rate was 0.4033. Okay. Well, we might need to check that, and I could be wrong. The source that I was looking at?
It's in fact the 4.433.
Okay, so I was looking at another typo somewhere else. That was on a county website. My initial concerns stem from the fact that this is, at least in my understanding, a fairly delicate time for the town of Pittsburgh in terms of revenues as compared to the growth of demands. And it just, in my gut, it feels like the wrong time for us to be giving incentives. But that's not based on any particular analysis. And to kind of do even more hand waving, back of the envelope, it looks like this is between the county's granted incentive and what's been requested of the town. That's $567,000 total between the two. Granted, that's not a present value figure, but looking at the $14 million for the total investment, granted, admittedly an estimated investment, is that right, Mr. Bradley? Because we don't know yet exactly what the hotel would cost. A 4% figure, which on our side is a really big figure, but for the total project incentive, it doesn't seem like very much. And so I'm questioning, why would such a small amount of incentive be so vital to attracting a company that's not yet even designated?
Well, I'll give you two reasons. One, and we went through the same fiscal gymnastics at the county level, and there, if you aren't aware, as part of the process, there was a hotel operator that specializes in having on-campus lodging facilities that looked at co-locating on the community college campus with the Ag Center, and their study was exactly the same as our hospitality providers, and it said there will not be enough market here to build a hotel before 2022, 2023. So that's one thing. We want to pull that forward sooner rather than later since the Ag Center is going up. The second piece, lost my second point, but it's the second point I was going to make is that the sales tax revenue that is going to be generated by this facility more than offsets any lost property tax, which is unusual. Typically in the incentive, when you're doing this for a business or an industry or job, manufacturer of some kind, there really isn't a sales tax, annual sales tax split. What's the split between the town and the county on sales tax revenue generated? Talking about $400,000 annually. How much will the town get of that?
Go back to the budget.
Okay. I mean, that's not all of the counties, and the cities, but the city's going to get a lot of revenue that won't occur for 2 or 3 or 4 years. The other point I was going to make, because there's no other hotels, it's very difficult to get these properties financed. And so to show a strong commitment of the community that you're willing to incent a hotel, which is unusual, will help the hospitality operator go to their lender and say there's a commitment for this community to be here to help us establish the market. So it gives them some freeboard in the normal sort of operations to help that. So while it doesn't seem like a lot in terms of the asset, you've also got to look at the operating expenses, which we don't have here, and that would be important to their lender.
So then I guess also because of how small that is, I mean, our proposed share will only be 1.65% of that hotel investment. I mean, I'm anticipating that it would be likely we would hear again another request for some sort of incentive. I just don't see how else it's going to make the pull necessary to entice an investor to do it. And I mean, I guess I just have so many questions of who would eventually be the operator. Things I think that would be incumbent upon them in terms of commitments. That I'm hesitant to even bring up any of the ideas that I've brainstormed since Hampton is not yet confirmed. Is that correct?
Hampton is granted a franchise to our hospitality operator. But then when they build that franchise is the issue. That's really the reason for the incentive. So they have granted a franchise. That's what they're planning to build when they build their hotel. So I don't, the commitments are in the contract, what we have there, and if there's anything that's along those lines that the town feels needs to be added for the town to provide an incentive, and then it's a contract. And the EDC enforces it because they have to they have to make their application to the EDC. The EDC comes to the town agrees, yes, check all these boxes, and then we'll grant based on these agreements. So you'll have an enforcement mechanism if they don't do those things. So.
So it's not necessarily something that Pittsburgh's going to get within the next 5 or 6 years, but the incentive just means we would get it sooner, and therefore we look at the revenue that we would make in those first 5 years to justify.
That's correct.
That's a very helpful clarification.
And the other way to look at incentives as well, and there's kind of difference in terminology, but in a previous life we did what were called tax statements, which would, in this previous life, we would have made 50% of added taxable value for a new project. And the way that it was typically described as that you're getting a half full glass of water as opposed to a half empty glass of water. Now, it's a little bit more complicated here because in year one you're actually getting a glass of water that's really 10% full, but over the years it becomes more full. Now, some of you may be reluctant to drink that little bit at the bottom of a glass, but I can tell you in this case it's clean water and it's added revenue. So it's really kind of a matter of perspective. Would we be getting the 100% net tax or 100% tax revenue if the project came off in year one as expected? No. But then again, it's argued that as Commissioner Foley indicated that it could be coming at an earlier stage and thus may be worth the incentive. So that's, I think, kind of a positive way to look at it. The commitments themselves are kind of, they were presented, and I think the language in this letter virtually unchanged. I think the language is specific to Ag Center. The purpose for you tonight was to really, in an overall sense, discuss these incentives. The town's never really had this conversation, at least in terms of ad valorem tax granting. So to be honest with you, I wasn't quite sure where the discussion would fall from the 6 of you tonight. So we certainly can craft some commitments that are a little bit more applicable to what you guys are talking about tonight, and would be something that I think helps justify it. If you choose to go that direction, would be something that helps justify it from our perspective. And I think you just speak from the heart on it. You guys have all said we need a hotel. We probably need it sooner than later. We are probably willing to incentivize that hotel for these reasons, and we simply put those things into some sort of memorialized fashion. Now, do we want to enter into any clawbacks? That's where it gets a little bit more particular. And how do we, what sort of stipulations do we put in there in terms of the clawback? I think that's really kind of a process that is probably better established through the agreement itself, which is my understanding that at the county level that agreement hasn't been finalized yet. So there's still some work to do even at their level. But that agreement is what we could move forward with at the end of the day in terms of insurances. And again, in this previous life that I talked about, even those those tax statements had clawbacks. They weren't overly complicated or onerous on the part of the local government granting those statements. There were some cases where when you had to make the investment, first of all, you had to certify that investment was made before you could actually receive the abatement. I would envision something similar here. But do we go as deep as saying that, well, jobs have to be of a certain wage, and do we have to have X number of jobs as indicated? That's where it gets a little bit more complicated. But really, again, the purpose here was to kind of get your reaction, show you what the county has agreed to this point, see what your wants and needs are for this moving forward. And that recommendation from me on the 27th wasn't necessarily something that I was going to ride or die with. I mean, if you want to continue the discussion, you could set the public hearing for the 27th. Now, a public hearing is required before you would agree to any incentives, so you just have to keep that in mind as well. But there's nothing that demands that you have to set that public hearing for the 27th. And even if you did set the public hearing for the 27th, there's nothing that would require you to make an approval on that
we use a term here called clawback, and I just want to clarify, this is a different kind of incentive. Typically, those are employed where there's a large upfront grant that's been put in place to deal with infrastructure or something, and then you want a mechanism if 2 years down the road they don't hit the employment standards or whatever else, you can ask for a refund back. In this case, there's sort of an empiric standard. It's either that letter or any additions to it, and if they've met, then they get, and they're 100% paid up and everything, then they would get the grant incentive. If they haven't, then they wouldn't. They could apply for it the next year, but they wouldn't get it that year. So it wouldn't really be it's either awarded or not awarded. There wouldn't be a clawback. But
there could be a clawback. There could be a clawback. I mean, in theory, there could be. It's not accurate to say that there won't be a clawback, because there couldn't be a clawback.
Well, there's not in the counties because it's granted each year. So
I realize that. That's fair.
And I guess one of the things that bothers me just a bit is the idea that really when you're looking at comparing the town of Pittsboro financially with the county of Chatham, you're comparing apples and oranges. And we have much less financial ability and wherewithal than the county does. And so
keep in mind you're going to have, I guess, half, I don't know how it's split, but half of $400,000 a year in sales tax. If you can get that, that's $200,000 a year in sales tax revenue. If you get that for 2 or 3 years, or 4 years, or 5 years, as Commissioner Foley said, that's revenue you wouldn't have at all. That's
sales based on hotel.
That's correct. Yeah, that's
Mr. Brown, it is a good point.
Alternate business that occurs while the visitor is staying.
Right. Indirect effects. And we can get those things pinned down and enumerated, and that would be helpful. And Commissioner Farrell, I appreciate you bringing up the percentage structure of the incentive, because in the little bit of reading I did, and again, talking about apples and oranges, there were some cities that have incentivized hotels, for example, on campuses or at airports, at convention centers. And the great number of those that I saw, it was a straight 50% incentive for a given number of years. So this is a structure. It's an idea. I think I would echo Randy Grusbeck. I thank you very much for pointing out kind of the sense here. There's some questions still to be addressed. There's some homework we can do. And there is, I think, an interest in seeing a hotel and possibly in supporting an incentive. So, in terms of commitments that might be specific to the town of Pittsburgh's interests, obviously we want to see the Ag Center succeed just as the county wants to see it succeed. It's just outside of our town, but it's an important part, in my mind, of the town. But to my knowledge, the only organization or entity in town other than government that might have an immediate interest in hosting a conference, the Carolina Farm Stewardship Association. I've been speaking with them back and forth for months now, trying to understand what it would be that would entice that organization to bring their annual event of 800 to 1,200 people to Chatham County, and they can't do it, even with this hotel, even with this Ag Center, because they're too big at this point. So, that's the thing in the back of my mind that's been the biggest push for me wanting to see a hotel. But, I think obviously there's just tourism. There's the idea that lots of people have in-laws come to town and don't have space for them. I'm certainly in that position. So, I don't think that there's the need for the hotel goes away. But again, turning back to commitments that I'd like to maybe see if there's ideas. What I've heard so far was some kind of local business or local procurement or local contract language. And I would add to that, we have tremendous arts community, and it'd be really wonderful to see the hotel operator promise to populate the halls with local art. I heard LEED mentioned in the structure of the county's incentive policy. That'd be great to see if the Hampton Inn has achieved the LEED certification on any of their structures. Well, that's just off the top of my head.
If the board is interested in the process at all, then perhaps you should authorize the manager to pursue it. And I don't think you all are going to negotiate this tonight.
I was thinking brainstorming, but I agree.
Well, one of the things I noticed from reading is that the incentive package wouldn't necessarily be specific to the hotel or a hotel within the 44 acres. And one of the incentives or one of the conditions that I would like for you to consider, if in fact it is in the 44 acres, in conjunction with Chatham Park, who have showed us repeatedly this red line that is a transit way from this portion of the development through town, back out, 64 Business and around. And knowing that one of the ideas here is to provide transportation for groups going from this hotel to the Ag Center, I'd like to see thoughts on a regularly running public transit or multiple person transit vehicle that could be constantly looping in town. Because I'd love for the visitors at a hotel to come downtown and to see historic Pittsburgh as well. That's something I've been thinking about.
Okay. Just to clarify on that one, that had to do with the tourism, wanting to make sure groups came that way they would be able to get back and forth, and that was why that particular commitment's in there. But certainly understand.
Bring groups into town as well.
I mean, I can't speak for the hospitality operator, but most of these hotels have a van, and they typically are always glad to shuttle on demand. So I would anticipate they would have something. Whether they would want to commit to that up front, based on demand, that may be a little bit of a challenge. But we're happy to sit down with anybody and everybody, understand what your issues are before we have the public hearing, and we'll be glad to answer any questions and hopefully work through any of these issues and add any elements y'all feel are important for Pittsburgh's needs.
That's kind of thing that's pretty easy for people to get to where they want to go.
I don't have over yet.
So how would the board like to approach this? John's idea that the public hearing be out just a little ways, the authorization to the town manager for additional information. I know we've all got some questions and individual research we'd like to do. I know the owner of the Hampton Inn in Carrboro, and I'd sort of like to talk to him about the kinds of incentives that the town of Carrboro might see. So I think that, so what kind of a motion would be?
It sounds to me like we're all in favor of exploring doing incentives like this. We just wanted to make it unique to Pittsburgh, not necessarily because of what the county's going to do. So, is that true?
That's true. And Mr. Method indicated, I think it would be a task that Mr. Grustack, as well as us, in undertaking, looking at this a little closer, and then he's certainly indicating different commitments for the town. We also doing that. But I think that's definitely something we need to look at in reference to the incentives and how we need to tweak that, because we do need to tweak it. It needs to be a little different from how the county has indicated, because as we've all said, the county has a lot more money than we do. And hopefully, in the end, we will get funds from the sales force, as you've indicated. But we've got to tweak this, certainly, in reference to Pittsburgh. And also, when we're talking about a hotel, everyone knows that UNC, football, basketball, everything, they need places to stay. And they will come to Pittsburgh. That's for sure.
I think we should explore this further. Most definitely think it's some tool you want to have in your toolkit, that's for sure. And the thought that comes to my mind is that next Monday night, or next Monday, we're going to spend a lot of time together, and maybe we can take a half an hour, 45 minutes to brainstorm on this as part of the retreat.
And I think we have to too figure out what's realistic. Like we're saying, I like the idea of having local construction workers, but you have a good point. There's a special skill, and the same with art. It's probably not going to have original artwork in all the rooms, but maybe the hotel lobby and things like that. So we have to figure out what's going to benefit the town, but also what's realistic to expect retail chain.
Well, local artists might be willing to allow reproductions of their work.
Yeah.
Photographs of their work.
But my point is just to make sure that, make sure we're not.
So is there a motion going out?
I'll move that we empower the manager to negotiate unique additional commitments from the town of Pittsburgh's perspective, and that we move the public hearing to March 27th. And with respect to Commissioner Baldwin's concerns, address a incentive schedule that's more appropriate to our financial needs.
Does it need to be March 27th or 2 weeks?
I think 27th is a month later than what was proposed.
Right.
Do we need a month or we need?
Do we need a motion today or enough from when we were going to have it?
I don't know that we need to find it. Why don't we let Manager Grusbeck figure out what is a good time frame for it?
Well, let's bear in mind that 27th February is already public hearing on zoning. Excuse me. Yes, zoning and additional elements.
I don't know that we'd have to set the public hearing tonight for that 27th. So definitely looking at least 2 meetings away. I don't know if it needs to be 3.
So that would be
We just need 10 days to advertise the public hearing.
the 13th.
You need to have something to advertise about,
Yeah.
though.
I mean, it could be. I can definitely see that happening.
You need to have something to advertise about. I mean, you can't just have a public hearing and talk about generalities. You're going to have a specific proposal. I don't know that you are at that point yet.
I think we can have that by 27th of February, perhaps.
That's 2 weeks. Okay.
I should ask Manager Grusbeck.
We could have a proposal on the 27th. We'll see. Yeah, we could have a proposal. We'll see. I mean, if it isn't one you guys are going to be 100% behind, I don't know, but we'll work hard to get there.
It'll be a
Cover a
week
lot
after
of
the
ground.
retreat, so we'll have to.
Yeah, a lot.
And so, John Bonas' motion is that the town manager be empowered to create a draft ordinance by the 27th of February. That we then discuss it at both our retreat and then again at that meeting. Are we prepared to have a public hearing on that date, or are we moving the public hearing into February?
In March. I would propose
That's March.
public hearing March 13th.
March 13th. Okay. All right. Is there a second to Mr. Bonas' motion? Second. Second by Pamela Baldwin. Is there further discussion on the motion? Those in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much. Our next agenda item under new business is the site plan review for Arbor Gate Solar Farm. Victoria will lead us in this discussion.
Okay, we have site plan SP 2017-1, Arbor Gate Solar Farm. Strata Solar has submitted plans for review and recommendation The proposal is to construct a solar farm in which solar panels will be erected on approximately 59.43 acres along Hanks Chapel Road, east of D. Farrell Road. The property is currently zoned RA2. The planning board considered this proposal at its meeting on February 6th. The board made general inquiries into the maintenance needs of the vegetation which is to be used, and also posed questions regarding types of fencing and screening which will be in place. The planning board found these plans to be acceptable and voted unanimously to recommend approval. These plans have been reviewed in accordance with the town's applicable development ordinances by the appropriate departments, and the staff is recommending approval of the proposed request.
Are there questions from the board?
I just have one, and I'm sure the friends of mine here probably can answer that, but there is a cemetery back over there on that area. Is that correct? Isn't that correct, Dave?
There is.
What is the plan with that? I saw it in here. Is it fenced off?
Can you point to it on the site plan? That dashed line?
Yeah.
So that's not part of your project?
No, it's not.
Thank you.
Is it on the property?
No, it's not.
Okay, so it's a different parcel.
And this is a site plan review because rezoning is not necessary since this is a permitted use within a RA district, is that correct?
We're classifying it as a utility, which is a permitted use.
And would you like to speak, sir, for the
I would just like to answer any questions that the board may have. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
I'm sorry, your name, sir?
Jim Haley with Strata Solar.
Thank you. Anyone have any questions for the chair?
I'm sorry, your name again?
First name is Jim, last name is Haley, H-A-L-E-Y.
All right, thank you. The Strata Solar, I guess it's the warehouse in northern Chatham County.
On Farrington Road?
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That one is buffered or kind of concealed by a combination of fencing and plantings.
That's correct.
What have you envisioned for this project?
For this project, there's buffer that will be planted along Hank Chapel Road, along the entirety here. There's a section up here off of Barrel Road. There's another section here. And it's going to be a double row of evergreens, and they're on 10-foot centers. So you really have like 5 feet between each stem, and they'll be staggered.
I take it that meets our buffer standards?
Yes.
Can I get confirmation?
Yes.
Or plan? Yes, thank you.
And how do you maintain the growth from how you maintain it?
We've got an operations involved. We've got two crews. One, we have a vegetative maintenance crew that actually does the installation of the buffers and gets them started. And then we have an operations and maintenance crew that actually checks on the buffers and waters them and makes sure that if any plants die, they're replaced.
You meant like around the whole panel. How do you keep the brush from?
Probably 8 to 10 times a year. They actually mow inside the FM. So becomes less of an issue. If we get weeds that come up, the weeds tend to really shoot up and come in between the panels and shade the panels, and that becomes an issue. But then we actually have to go out and mow.
So it's all done by mowing and not by herbicide application, is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, we do have some farms that have sheep, actually.
What's your minimum acreage size to do it that way?
What's that?
With sheep.
With sheep, it's really more, I guess, a preference of the landowner and of soil conditions. The one area that we did sheep, it was very, very rocky, and we just couldn't get really grass to grow correctly and to till it up to create a good seed bed. So we decided to use sheep for that. But like I said, we only have I think maybe two farms where we do that, and they're on the western part of the state. So that's less of a size requirement, more of, I guess, a ground cover situation.
And this particular project will be on two sides of the road, correct?
That's correct, yeah.
So there's a significant amount of kind of visual landscape viewshed interface on both sides of the road.
There is, and there's working with the town on here. There's sort of a profile that we did. This area does sort of drop off, so really from the road and with the buffer, it will screen because the landscape drops off from the road.
Well, Mr. Haley, I think solar farms are beautiful. Not everybody does. I think wind turbines are beautiful. And I think it's a necessary addition to our county. I would like to see an awful lot more solar panels on the rooftops of buildings. This is personal views. I'm just going to take the point of privilege to share with you as a representative of the developer, because I respect what Strata is doing. A further concern that I have that I won't belabor at this point in the game, but would love to have further conversations with your company. At one point I became aware, I quantified all of the solar farm developments across the state, and look into how much acreage was being converted, granted on a temporary basis, of both active farmland and woodland. Because my understanding of the imperative right now with both combating climate change and shifting our economy into directions that allow us to be more resilient against natural disasters or weather events or fossil fuel price fluctuations. Not only do we need more clean and renewable energy, but we also need more landscape that pulls carbon out of the atmosphere and stores it. That's what forests and farms do. And so, granted, it's on a very small scale, percentage-wise, but the solar farms that are just built on arable land or even worse on former woodlands are kind of a little bit of a step backwards in regards to the goal of carbon sequestration in addition to greenhouse gas mitigation. And it's something to bring out because I personally feel, the International Year of Soil was 2015, and so a lot of people became aware of this, but still not everybody knows. We've got to not only create a global energy system that is zero greenhouse gas emissions, but we've got to begin to run the machine backwards and suck carbon out of the atmosphere and put it somewhere safe. So where do we do that? It's in the soil. It's in farms. It's in woodlands. I really like your project, and I'll support it. But I appreciate you listening to me, and I look forward to future conversations about it.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Chris, I don't see a grading plan. Are you changing the?
No, we're not. We're using a system called EP Alternatives, and it can accommodate changes in topography. And typically, we don't like to grade. It's fairly disruptive to the landscape. Water quality is a huge concern by the town, and also for Chatham County. And so, this site was timbered about 20 years ago. And it's really obvious if you go walk it. You can see spoils from timber, from previous timber. Right now, pines are coming up there about 20 years old. But we'll go in there. We will take those down, but when we, I guess, to come back, we're not planning on any mass grading or like leveling out the site flat or anything like that. So the panels will go with the topography. One of the things you can see on the site plan why it is so broken up is that this is somewhat of a ridge here. This is somewhat of a ridge here, and this is as well. These areas in here are very steep, and we just want to stay out of them. So we aren't doing any planning of mass grading.
Do you have to get an erosion control permit to do this?
Yes, we will get an erosion control permit through Chatham County, and we also get a permit from NCDOT for the drop flow up here to get in there. So we'll have those permits in place before we start construction.
I think the impervious surface is 0.1% or something like that.
It's fairly low. Yeah, usually around I'd say 0.8 or 1, depending on the post.
So no permanent devices for stormwater.
We do have a extended dry detention basin, so it's basically a basin that will fill up when it rains and then slowly drain out. So we do have that. That will be a permanent basin.
Is that a device that's going to need a stormwater permit? Okay, so it'll be one of these that's monitored yearly and reported on yearly. Got it. Okay.
As well as their native planting area, it's also part of the stormwater program.
Yeah, so on the outside of the fence here, you do have to clear for shade, so the panels are going to get shaded so we can get power. We've got a native grass mix going in here. It's kind of canted, so once a year it's knocked down to the ground, but it's supposed to get up to about 4 feet to stay there. So whereas inside the array, it'll be more like a turf that's maintained regularly to stay off the panels. This is going to be allowed to sort of provide some habitat and just be sort of a native grass mix, not a farm or turf as well. And that's outside of the fence here and along the edge, and really in the area where we have to what we call shade buffer on the outside of the fence.
Yes, this is a site plan. There was no notification to adjoining landowners, is that correct? Have you had interaction with the adjoining landowners?
We have not. Does the owner speak on that at all? Notification.
The neighbors, the only neighbor I have not talked to would be Mr. Cotton. Others, or the CPC or the Tiger, what do you call it? They're okay with it. Basically, the only neighbor would be Cliff Cotton. Other than that, I've talked to Paige Davis, Albergate, Fells Albergate. She's okay with it. That's about it.
And maybe Paige could be hired to do some of the landscaping. We'd love for you to use that.
I noticed that when we were doing our site visit, we saw some trucks pulling just north of the site, and so we're going to be planting a lot of trees. They had some large tree augers in the backs.
How close to Albergate Road are you going to be?
We're right there. We're right on Albergate.
I mean, as far as your buffer is concerned.
This is one that goes right on Albergate.
Other further questions from the board?
No, but all the questions that I was going to ask you has already been answered. It was about the fencing and all of that. So, thank you.
Second. Moved by Michael Fiasco, seconded by Bette Wilson Foley. Those in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, motion carries unanimously.
Thank you.
Old business. Oh, excuse me. Number 3, commercial site plan review fee.
Yeah, so there's a little tag along to the prior site plan approval that you just did. So through this process, we we have review fees that we charge developers. And the way our current review fees through the budget is set up is that any project that's over 1 acre or a portion thereof is charged $4.40 per acre or that portion of an acre. What this does is it really penalizes large developments such as this one. And you have a memo from Strata, you have a memo from staff. Strata calculated their cost of review fees to be somewhere a little over $26,000 for this commercial site plan. That would be more than any jurisdiction that I'm aware of in the state or anywhere. Strata gave you all some examples of review fee schedules from other jurisdictions. I polled Chatham County and Siler City as well. And again, we would be higher than Chatham County and Siler City, with both of those coming somewhere in the $2,000 range or so for this size project. If the board is inclined, this is sort of a precursor to some discussions that I would like to have through the budget process upcoming, that we need to look at all of our review fees from plating processes all the way to commercial site plan review. Some fees we charge too much, as tonight. Some fees we don't charge at all. I think there's a need to look at our review schedule. And not only from a planning standpoint, I think in the request from Strata, the stormwater review fees are also based off of acreage per acre and a portion thereof. So it would be working with other departments to look at our review fees. I'm proposing that if the board is okay with moving forward, is that we sort of do this one on a faster track, because we haven't collected any fees from Strata on this project, just because this was an issue ongoing, and I didn't want to charge them the $26,000 fee without having the discussion with you all. If you're inclined to amend the fee as staff has suggested to a flat fee of $4.40 per acre, and then any portion thereof would be $25 an acre, that would bring us to about $1,900 for this type of project on this acreage. That would bring us in line with other jurisdictions around here. What we would do is a budget amendment at the next meeting. We would have to set up the mechanisms to make that happen, and we would collect the fee at a later time from Strata. There's still things that they have to do for us to get permits. So I think there's time to still collect this fee and make it right. I'm just looking for a little direction from you all tonight.
Yeah, I have one question. It's been several months, but didn't we have this conversation, something to do with these fees with Chatham Park? On some type of fee?
Well, there was a fee for...
Outrageous.
Well, there was a fee that we were... I think it was not the additional elements fee, but a small area plan fee that we were discussing, that through the small area plan process that you all adopted in 2015 had a fee associated with it based off of a flat fee and then acreage their portion thereof afterwards. So that you are remembering correctly, that there was a sort of a similar mechanism set up for small area plans. I think it was.
The question arose with the developer. There was a similar fee for that, and they didn't want to do that.
Developer agreement, is that?
But the small area plan fee is still in place.
Okay. I couldn't remember. Developer agreement, what it was. But it's similar. I think it was $825, and then it was $25 an acre or something afterward. I can't remember what the mechanism was.
Well, Mr. Jones, I think your review was very thorough. You took into consideration the submission from Strata. Your memo is clear cut, and I think your justification is very strong too. So adjustment that you proposed. I'd love to hear from other board members now.
Well, I think I would be in support too. I think there's a huge discrepancy there. And one of the metrics I'd like to better understand is there a way to gauge the staff time put in on this particular review to see, how much man hours, woman hours are involved in this, and does that fee compensate or share the burden, if you will, of some of the review? Because clearly, I don't think we want the development community to pay salaries.
I think we come closer to that at the $1,900 range than the $26,000 range. We certainly would be making a profit at that range, but then it just doesn't feel right to be charging that kind of fee for this type of project, or any project that really for us we wouldn't be utilizing $26,000 worth of staff time. It's not a public hearing, in fact, for this particular project, and that even more seems like it's not as much work for this type of review.
I think they acknowledge that most of their permits are special use permits, which clearly have a public hearing and get much more involved. And I did a little bit of scouting myself, looking at what fees are, and I'm finding that a good way or ways that other municipalities are trying to do that for gauging impact is having a base fee and then basing it on a portion of square footage. Square footage being some indicator of complexity.
Yeah, as I said, this is a precursor. We're going to be looking at our fee schedule more comprehensively in the budget, so that's to come. I don't think there is. I think it's just a discussion of direction. We'll come back with the appropriate budget amendment. Thank you.
Now I go to Jim Nash, we have a ABC update with you.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Commissioners, on behalf of Ned Kelly and Hugh Harrington, the other board members of the ABC, I want to give you a mid-year review of where we stand at the ABC board. We've had a good half year. We finished the retail expansion that I talked about with you a few meetings ago in time for the holidays, and we were able to put all of the holiday displays and all of the holiday packages back in that space, and it turned out to go very well. And we've had good comments from customers about that space, and it's given us a remarkable amount, actually more additional shelf space than we anticipated. That whole back wall, if you've been in there, we equaled that shelf space of that whole back wall by this addition, so it's been quite worthwhile. We have made final decisions on uniforms for our employees to try to raise the professionalism in the store, and so that's going quite well, and I think they'll be ready to unveil that within the next couple of weeks. We spent some time on alcohol education this 6 months. Indeed, we sponsored, along with the Chatham Drug Free, an endeavor that I talked to you about at Northwood High School that's going well, and we are beginning to talk to some folks from Talk It Out. We've had some excellent reports of success in the Talk It Out program, and our general manager is setting up some meetings and further discussions with that group. And I had a meeting with the police chief this past week, and one of the items we discussed was the Talk It Out folks and Chatham Drug Free both as good opportunities for us in that area. And the chief and I have met to spend more time even together in terms of their work for us in policing the alcohol program within Pittsboro, and also in getting their help and advice as we continue to work on alcohol education. Now, for more than 6 months, our revenues were up overall 4.6%, good solid performance. But our mixed beverage sales were up 6.8%, which is, again, a really good indicator of how well our restaurants are doing in town. And they continue, reporting period after reporting period to increase. And so on that basis, we have for you tonight checks in the amount of $13,994 for the town that represent the second quarter distribution. And I'd be glad to answer any questions any of you might have about ABC operations in general or this past 6 months in particular.
Does the board have questions for Jim Ness?
No questions, just comments that you guys are doing a great job. Happy to be a part of it. Go to the meetings, and the morale is fantastic. And I think you guys are just doing a really great job of turning this operation around.
Well, thank you, and I want to thank the board for your confidence in reappointing me to the board again, and I look forward to another solid 3 years there doing that. And with that, if there are no more questions, I'll give these checks to you, Madam Mayor, if I may approach.
Thank you, please. Thank you so much. I would like to simply say I'm really delighted that you're working with the Top It Out program. I went to a Kiwanis meeting recently where that program was highlighted, and it looks like from their television ads they have a very effective program, and so I'm delighted to hear that you all are working.
Well, thank you. Yeah, we really have been searching for those kinds of programs that there's some demonstrable positive, forward results that you can kind of look at. And we're fortunate in having a retired physician on our board who applies some of the scientific background of some of this stuff. So thank you.
Thank you. And we have you for our next additional elements committee update with Jeff Jones and with you, Jim Ness.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor, members of the board. Jim is going to give you the board's recommendations on the second set of elements that they considered, which are going to be open space, tree protection, landscaping, and stormwater. We're well into the third set. We'll have a meeting next week on public facilities and affordable housing. And at that point in time, we would have discussed all the elements in Chatham Park's additional elements manual. So we're getting close to at least considering and discussing all the elements. What's going to happen with the first set is they're going to go to the planning board in March with potentially this set as well. If you all are in favor of holding a public hearing at the 27th meeting, holding that public hearing, getting feedback from the public on these four elements, I could see Chatham Park having some time to respond to what the committee has recommended, staff has recommended. Staff will also be giving you comments at the 27th meeting. And if Chatham Park can give me responses prior to the planning board will be asked to consider both the first set of elements and the second set of elements to give you all their formal recommendation. If they do that at the March meeting, then it will be coming back to you all for some sort of action on those two sets of elements, with the third one being a little bit further out to the end of the April time frame. So I'll turn it over to Jim, and he'll be able to go over the recommendations of the committee.
Thank you, Jeff. And I just want to mention the fact that several of you have been able to stop by and attend one or several of our meetings. But I wanted to let you all know that the people that on this committee that you all appointed have been outstanding. They are committed. They do their homework. They are fully prepared, and they spend a lot of time digging in not only just to the additional elements, but also in looking at the UDO proposals and looking at the master plan. It's a lot of reading, a lot of work. So you're to be congratulated on your selections. They're a great group of people. Let's see here. Okay. The first section, additional element that we looked at in this group is open space. And what we are recommending here is that every time a small area plan is presented, that it include a running total of the amount of open space in that plan and in ones that have come before it. Broken down what we're calling the regulated open space and non-regulated open space. And by regulated open space, we mean that part of open space that is mandated as a part of the buffering system through either ordinance or law or some other feature, separated from that open space that's not mandated by that sort of thing. What we're trying to do here was say, we know that a bunch of the open space is going to be in buffers, particularly riparian buffers. I'd like to keep that a little bit separate. We think that will give the town a good view as they're reviewing these small area plans as just exactly where we stand. And that sort of gets into the second recommendation here, where we talk about the payment in lieu. Because one of our concerns is you could theoretically keep postponing open space until you got very near the end and then say, oh, by the way, we're going to do payment in lieu instead with very few options because the land that would have been in open space is no longer available. Now, we don't suspect that will happen, but again, this running total will let the town and the planning board be able to keep up to date exactly where we're at in this open space area. And the second recommendation to just simply state that payment in lieu for open space must be approved by the town, just as to clarify the language, because if you read the language that's in the additional element, it sounds as though it simply is presented as a done deal to Chatham Park with no approval mechanism from the town. And the committee believes that there ought to be a look-see where Chatham Park, we want to do some payment in lieu of for these reasons. We agree or we don't agree, rather than say we're just going to do X amount of payment in lieu with no approval mechanism. So that's the basis of the two recommendations on open space. Are there questions on the open space one?
I think it's through the open space one. It's difficult in my mind immediately to understand what regulated means.
Our definition of regulated was that's required. I think I made some notes specifically. That was mandated by the master plan, the additional elements of ordinance that are specifically called out as being a man. For example, there's mandates for certain kinds of buffers that have to be presented, and there is not an option as to whether or not you do that or not. It's a requirement. And that's counted as open space, and we don't have a problem with that. We just think it's a good idea to separate that out so that the town knows that this is mandated open space that's mandated through buffering regulations, either in the master plan, the additional elements, or by ordinance. And here's a whole other set of open space that aren't mandated by that. For example, the greenway, the area that we're showing in the North Village, where the theater district is. That piece of open ground is open space, but it's not mandated by any other section of the elements or the master plan or ordinance or law. That's something that's being provided outside of that mandate.
Well,
that would be non-regulated.
I think the master plan does refer to in the activity centers, and then granted that 44 acres outside the activity center must have a minimum of a contiguous 2-acre open space. So you kind of qualify.
Yeah.
So you're thinking along the lines of things that have been committed to in the master plan as a regulatory.
Yeah, that's required by the master plan because it's been accepted by the town, been offered by Chatham Park. It's now regulated. That is, it has to go in.
Yeah. Okay. And I think the master plan also does talk about the idea of quantifying these spaces as the development goes.
Yeah, we just think the idea of a running total is a good idea.
Agrees with that.
I agree.
So that's good. And I think the master plan also tried to look towards that situation you just mentioned about getting to the end and there's not enough.
Mm-hmm.
I think the master plan says, there will never be less than this much open space. So
Well,
I'm thinking along those lines.
yeah, except the committee doesn't think it's particularly clear that we can get to the end and may be able to satisfy that requirement with payment in lieu.
Well, I agree with this, that yes, it has to be an agreement with the town.
On the definition of regulatory, can I ask a clarifying question? So that would also, or regulated, would also include, say, Corps of Engineers or other federal regulations for riparian zones?
That were required, yes. In other words, the thought of the committee in here was that if it's required, a master plan by law or by ordinance, that's regulated. If it's not, then it's not regulated. And there may be a more artful way of defining the differences. Mandatory or not mandatory. Although mandatory, you get into the question of a certain amount of open space is mandatory. And some portion of that will be in what we would call non-regulated.
Further questions on the open space?
In tree protection, what we're recommending is that the committee recommends that the town of Chatham Park adopt the provisions of the draft UDO Module 2, 4.2 tree coverage rather than their methodology. And what Chatham Park is proposing is not less than 10% tree coverage measured in acres. And what the draft UDO does is sets forth a pre-development tree canopy, and then based upon use, the minimum post-development tree canopy. So, for example, if the pre-development was like 68 to 76% tree canopy cover, then in residential, primarily, it works a little bit differently, but in residential it would require post-development of 25%, and then more commercial areas and post-development of 10%. So that there's a whole list in the draft UDO of percentages pre-development, and then what the minimum would be that's required in post-development. And Chatham Park proposes in their mixed, in the master plan and in the additional element to do this pre-development survey using certified arborists, et cetera, to define what the pre looks like. So we'll have a good idea what that pre is. Then, and rather saying just a minimum of 10% in acreage, we believe that the UDO does a much better job of laying out this is pre-development, this is post-development, and these are what the minimums look like. And we think we found very little reason to provide something different for Chatham Park in this particular instance of pre-protection and the rest of Pittsburgh, with what was going to be required of the rest of Pittsburgh. We thought there was a good reason for these to be unified. And we didn't think, as a committee, that the Chatham Park proposal of a minimum of 10% ought to supplant what was in the UDO. So we are suggesting that the UDO is what got to be followed. Second recommendation came up during the discussion of tree protection, doesn't necessarily relate to tree protection specifically, but the committee would like Chatham Park to define the term village. It's used in the master plan, it's used in almost every one of the additional elements. We're confused because the meaning doesn't quite seem to be the same when it's used in one additional element as opposed to the other additional element. And so we're confused, and we think if we're confused, there's a possibility that others might be confused about exactly what is meant by village as you go throughout the entire master plan and additional elements. And we think that ought to be defined before we, as you move forward, with a clear definition of exactly what's meant by the term village. We have village, we have activity centers, so it gets a little confusing. And so we think that the term village ought to be defined. Yeah.
Are there questions of Jim Ness at this point on tree protection?
I think I'll just put this out here because I'm not sure how the committee is thinking about it, nor actually how the UDO is thinking about it, or even Chatham Park's thinking about it. But we're talking about 10%, and we're talking about this graduated based on use,
right,
pre-post development. And I think there are going to be portions. And the thought is this measured on a lot-by-lot basis? Because I know there's going to be a style of development that we have downtown. The entire lot is covered with a building and a sidewalk and a parking space in front of it. And there's a 0% tree protection, tree coverage, whatever you want to call it. And I'm just wondering, thinking about the idea of having different metrics for different styles of development. You would call the downtown urban.
Yep.
And you say, well, in an urban, highly urbanized environment, maybe we make different requirements versus suburban versus rural.
Yeah, and then the additional element we've heard, Chatham Park does propose that that at least there's got to be tree, depending upon usage again, there has to be tree cover. That 10% doesn't mean that you could go for a whole large section of development and have 0 trees whatsoever, and then put 50 trees together in this location over here and meet the requirement. So it does to that extent, but there is recognition, I think, in both the UDO and in Chatham Park proposal, although I think more so in the UDO, that commercial sites, downtown sites, heavily parts of that nature will have less requirement in terms of tree canopy or tree coverage than suburban areas. But remember, when we talked about the parking element, there's a specific provisions concerning the number of trees and how trees are planted in parking lots that would be, for example, at some of the locations you looked at earlier on the screen. There's going to be parking involved with that, and the parking regulations require very specific planting of trees. And even in, not necessarily downtown, but even in some of the urban areas, there's some requirements for trees between, to get into the landscaping element, between the sidewalk and the property line, that median piece in there where the street and the sidewalk where trees are going to be planted. I mean, if you take all those pieces in together that Chatham Park is proposing, where you put trees in that median between the street and the sidewalk, and you have trees of different kinds, so that you have a uniform basis up to this block, and the next block could have a different kind of tree. I mean, if you just added all of that stuff up, there's no question in my mind that they would meet their 10%, just on the basis of the trees that they propose planting in all these different areas. And they do, in fact, recognize that there's a difference between those kinds of trees and the kind of trees that you might think of in more of a forest basis. But I think the UDO really more accurately takes a look at that pre-development scene and how that looks, and then applies what comes after that. It doesn't specify exactly how you meet that afterwards. It leaves it, again, to good common sense in the site plans as to where, obviously, in the downtown area, you're not going to be able to do the same thing with trees that you might be in the suburban area.
And part of that is, the question is, where is that 10% measured? Is it on the parcel? Because in the downtown, the street trees you were mentioning are in the street. They're in the public right of way. They're not on that parcel.
Yes.
But can they contribute to the percentage?
Yes, they contribute to the percentage, yeah.
Yeah, and so that's the question. Is it required on each individual parcel, or is it another way to look at it?
The committee in our discussions, committee in our discussions, I think nearly unanimously, Jeff, I think there might have been one dissenter, at not looking at it on a lot-by-lot basis, but at a broader view.
Okay. Is there a way to define a boundary that, I mean, if you're going to say you're a percentage of something, how do you define what something
Well, again, it depends on I think we were a little we thought about it in terms of small area plans, but we were operating under the assumption when we were looking at small area plans that these small area plans were going to be, in fact, small areas. And there's going to be a small area here, and then there'd be another one here, and another one here, and another one here, and another one here. And I'm not sure we were accurate in that assumption. And so the small area plan might be a lot bigger than what we had anticipated it being. And if that's true, then the board might want to consider something smaller than a small area plan, if the small area plan is in turn is a large area plan.
collection of areas?
Yeah, a big collection of areas. So there might be a different term that has to be used, because we were thinking when this was developed, the idea that a small area plan was in fact that. We thought, a pretty small areas. I don't know if it's the 40 acres that we talked about earlier, but not much bigger than that.
Well, I think there were 27 sections.
Something like that, or 27, yeah.
Each small area.
Yeah, and we thought if you got 27 and you did this UDO approach, small area plan by small area plan, you'd have a pretty good take on what you wanted in terms of tree protection in those areas. If it turns out that it's not 27 and it's 3, then you might need to have a different definition in the proposal.
Mr. Noss, I'm appreciating your point and the committee's recommendation and all the deliberation that went on at the meetings, and I witnessed it. It was good, solid work. I think I'm hearing you say that, if we were to assign the word exceptional to something, it would be the UDO, in that it looks at the current or pre-development status and may still allow even more flexibility than the 10%.
Yes. Yeah. And again, remember, to be fair to John Park, talked about that as the minimum 10%. They didn't mean that. And as we looked at it, there was a discussion in the committee that with the requirements for the trees that were going into the parking lots and the requirements of trees going into suburban residential areas in that space, between the roadway, the curb, and the sidewalk. That's a lot of trees, and it could very well reach pretty close to that 10% without much difficulty just with that. So again, remember, it's minimum 10%, but we really like the idea of doing of the UDO that's taking a look at what exists now, and saying, how do we preserve some of that, and what percentage is it reasonable to ask be preserved? And we just felt that the scale that the draft UDO represents was a better look. Now, it's debatable whether those percentages ought to be, a little different in the after as well. And I'm sure in discussion with developers, they might, wait a minute, in this particular case, you've got, 68% coverage pre-development. You want us to do 25% post-development. In this particular situation, that's not possible. But remember, in tree protection, we're talking about what exists and what can be planted. You might well have to remove something, but you have to replant. And certainly in the areas that we're talking about in residential areas, you're talking essentially about planting between that curb line and the post. But the committee overall, just to give you a sense, and I know I think a couple of you were at the tree protection one, the overriding guide for our committee was, obviously we want more trees rather than less within what's reasonable and what's doable. When we talk about, it came up in my mind when we talked about public art, we were talking about using buildings as sculptures and other things as sculptures. And I think of trees as living sculptures in many ways, except that they don't erode and they don't need painting. Rain actually helps them. It doesn't erode away. And so, in that sense, the bias of the committee is, of course, more. Our job wasn't so much to balance, although we tried to be reasonable in that projection, which is why the UDL approach seemed the best to us. I mean, we would have had at least a few votes for something a lot more strenuous, but I think trying to balance what was doable and reasonable with what our desires were.
Anything further on tree protection? And stormwater is our next.
Yeah, now stormwater was tough for us, and maybe for you simply because it's a pretty much technical subject, and we relied very heavily on our town engineer, Mr. Royal, to help us as we went through this discussion. But there's a couple of things here that we went for. In our discussion, the committee thought we ought to ask Chatham Park to tell us kind of why they are not going to use the rational method. And this gets down into the weeds a bit, but Chatham Park lists in the additional elements that they're not going to use the rational method to determine BPEs in Chatham Park, but they could be used for something else that's undefined. Then they also said they could use National Resource Conservation Service method that may be used, or that other design method may be used. And I guess what the committee is really trying to get at with this recommendation that you asked them why is to maybe see if we can get a better handle on what they are going to use under what conditions as they move forward. I mean, we understand that this is a field where we gather from Mr. Royal and from the presentation from Chatham Park that this is a dynamic field and lots of new things are becoming available. And we don't want to stifle creativity, which is, I think, a good reason why they're not more definite in terms of just exactly what they are going to use. So I think I'd like you to think of this recommendation of trying to engage in the discussion to understand Chatham Park's thinking on what they might use where and how and why that is what they're choosing to do without trying to limit them. We're not, as a committee, saying we have this bias for the rational method because we think that's the best. We know it's the simplest and is very widely used from the literature. But there are all these methods, and we think that discussion as to why they're doing what in that regard would be worthwhile. And in the second recommendation, in the master plan, there's an item that talks about stormwater, and it talks about the standards, and it lists five things. But in the additional element, it says the master plan, and then it lists only 4 things. And the thing that's missing is one that said that these were to be considered minimum standards. In the master plan, that is there as an item number 5. In the additional elements, it says it's from the master plan, but item 5 is missing. Now, it could just be an oversight or whatever, but we think if it's in the master plan, and this is a carryover from the master plan and the additional elements, that item 5 ought to be there. And if it's not there for a very good reason, we ought to find out why that isn't there and what the rationale behind it is. Because we think the statement that these are to be considered minimum standards is, at least it sounds to us as though it's important and ought to be continued on into the additional element as well. And our concern was that the additional element might override the master plan in this particular case, and there ought to be a good reason for doing that with the exclusion of that item number 5. So that is our rationale for our recommendations for stormwater such as they are.
and I may have missed it, Jim, go over this rational method again?
Well, it's a method of determining, it's a system that's used to determine, given so much rain, essentially, and my understanding as a non-engineer, rain, how much rain and how you can measure what's going to be required to contain that runoff. And from that rain, and there's a formula, a mathematical formula that you use and put various inputs to that tells you that what you're going to need to have in the way of a device to manage that particular stormwater. In other words, come up with the best practices for that. Yeah, for that level of storm event. 1 inch an hour or whatever that storm event is, and you can use that method to go down. And I've looked at the formulas, and I didn't bother to plug numbers in because I didn't see it. But that's only one method. There are many other methods, some of which Chatham Park listed. It's just that the rational method was is reputed to be the simplest and the most widely used. And I believe, if I'm not saying something on your behalf, Mr. Roy, I believe the committee asked Mr. Royal, and he said he didn't know why they chose not to use it. And we don't know. In a narrow sense, we probably ought to find out why, but in a broader sense, there are all of these other ones that they do mention that may be used, but they don't define. We think it's worth a discussion as to how they're going to apply what without trying to stifle their creativity, because during the presentation, we were quite pleased to see some of the creative ways that they were looking at stormwater retention facilities as they're doing up in North Village right now, and as they propose to do some other places. And we didn't want to put a stop to that. So I can give you a reference on rational method if you want to.
Close enough.
In fact, I can give it to you right now. Here it is. But it's simply a mathematical way of taking a storm event and calculating what you're going to need to do to be able to manage it. Did I say that halfway reasonable?
It's simple and widely used. Sounds like really good.
Well, maybe, but then on the other hand,
stormwater is hardly simple.
Yeah, but on the other hand, I think the thing the committee gathered the most was that this is a very dynamic field, and there's a lot of new things coming out, a lot of new things happening, and we didn't want to make any kind of recommendation that stifled any of that creativity because we think it could all be good. We just wanted the town to be aware of the fact that there's a lot of maybes here, and might be worth some discussion as time goes on as to how this is going to be applied, where and when, what the rationales are.
As Jim said, many different methodologies for quantifying and calculating the impacts of stormwater. And the rational method has typically been used in a very small area. And it would be irrational to use that method in quantifying and calculating much larger areas and the impact of stormwater on that area, given the preconditions versus post-conditions. The nuance of trying to model a storm in reality, physics. And so oftentimes the rational method is going to be inadequate
to do
the job and to give you a reasonable facsimile of the correct answer. So I did not know that it was ruled out in its entirety.
Well, maybe it hasn't, except that the element itself says they have chosen not to use it. Yeah.
Any other questions on stormwater?
Okay, on landscaping, Chatham Park committed to using the Complete Streets Planning Design Guidelines in the Transit Edition, which, by the way, we think is outstanding. And this is simply trying to state that this carry over into the landscaping element for landscaping those areas that are adjacent to streets and roadways. And in the, for example, in the North Carolina streets and highways design elements, they have things called green zone, which is that landscaped area between the street pavement curb and sidewalk. And there's a sidewalk zone or multi-path zones that have some elements that relate to landscaping. And we're not saying that they're not planning to do that, but we as just a carryover of that North Carolina Complete Streets program into that landscaping element as it relates specifically to streets and roadways. We thought was consistent and worthwhile. We're very impressed, by the way, as a committee with the North Carolina Complete Streets and Roadways design elements. It's to us, it's very, very excellent piece. Then on the second recommendation, we thought it would be useful to have a resources section added to this element where we could put resources there, and I have citations that we can give for all of these where you can find out about it. A resource on what pollinator plants are useful, where to get native plants, where to get in-seed wildflower and native plants, what kinds are available. And Charlton Park might well want to come up with some additional resources that they think would be useful, and others might find things that would be useful. That this resource section could be continuously updated and kept viable as time goes on. And then a simple statement that landscapers be encouraged as they're putting together their landscaping plans for development to consult these resources, because to the extent that we can get some of these elements that I've talked about in the resources into the landscaping design, we think that will be a significant boom to appearance, utility, and the overall viability of the landscape. So that's the rationale behind landscaping.
Sounds excellent. Are there any questions in this section?
Yeah, the question I have has to do with the complete streets. The complete streets requirement is clearly stated in, I think, transportation or transit.
The transit, right.
And so it includes all the components of a complete street. Not only the landscape, but the width of sidewalks, with bike lanes, with parking spaces. Which type of road has this wide of a verge versus a sidewalk? And what I'm not sure is, does it describe what types of trees get planted? It might just say more trees, shade.
It doesn't say which kind specifically. No, the green zone here. It sets forth the minimum width of that green zone, that area in between, and it talks about street trees, or could include landscaping signs, benches, those kinds of things. So it's a design guideline, but it doesn't specify. In the additional element on landscaping, is wording in that, for example, on that green zone space of, as I said, you go with a particular tree that's chosen, I don't know, X tree that would be on this block, and then there's an encouragement to add variety by having a different kind of tree, perhaps in that space in the next block, and those sort of things as well.
My only question was whether or not the landscaping section also needed to make reference to complete streets, because once it's said, it's a requirement for streets to have these components.
Yeah.
And what my concern is that if the landscaping plan or the landscaping section were to speak specifically of a component of something in the complete street, that it might thought of it including the other components. And so if you've got a requirement or a standard, and I don't know that you need to repeat it.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. The idea that since we mentioned this particular component of complete streets and not all the other components of complete streets, would that mean that we only are requiring just this one thing? And certainly that wasn't the intent of the committee. The committee would not be at all upset if you all decided to not do something, to do something different in this area. But the committee's intent was that it simply carry over as a particular part of the landscaping effort as it related to those things adjacent to streets. Yeah.
If there are no further questions, we do need to set this for public hearing on the 27th, 7th and 27th. So we're going to have two selections of additional elements. Traffic impact RFQ. Two public hearings that we have tonight.
We will, this coming Wednesday, we will discuss, as Jeff mentioned to you, portable housing and public facilities. No,
A week from this Wednesday.
A week from this coming Wednesday. And then 2 weeks after that, we will meet to make recommendations. So you can see about a month from now, we will be in the process of making our recommendations on the final four. And so that's our time frame. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim.
I'll make a motion that we section on the for February 27th for the open space tree protection landscape and stormwater personal health.
Is there a second to Michael Fiocco's motion? Second. Seconded by Pamela Baldwin. Those in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, the motion carries unanimously. Jeff Jones, we're talking about planning board appointments.
Yeah. We're getting close to getting enough applications.
Keep vote yes. Big vote yes.
Motion for planning board.
We can say
Aye.
moved by Michael Fiocco, seconded by Jeff Baldwin.
Thank you very much.
Short money on me?
Yeah.
They're 99% gets attached.
Oh, I lost a cat about 2 minutes ago.
I'm going to Wilmington tomorrow night.
Thank you, Mayor, members of the board. Since our last meeting, we have received 2 applications for in-town membership on the planning board from Steve Cockman and Eric Braun. Eric Braun is a member of our Town Park Additional Elements Committee. So we have 2 applicants for you to consider tonight. One would be for regular appointment to the planning board, and one would be for an alternate appointment to the planning board. Consider what we have.
Board members?
I don't really know Eric, but I do know Steve Carter. He's a downtown resident, long-time resident and business person in town, so I don't have any problem supporting him. And I'm sure Eric is doing a great job also on the additional elements committee.
Well, Eric, I'm highly recommended for the chair of that committee.
No, I think we have that knowledge going into the planning board, it's nice to have that. I think I'm voting.
And I think Steve is qualified and is a longtime resident, businessman, homeowner.
So as long as it's taken us to get new planning board members, Jeff, is there a vacancy coming up that the alternate could slide in as a
regular in-town member?
Yeah.
Not until the December time frame, okay. We would have people going on.
So this year, someone will.
I would have to relook at the chart.
That's the chart right here.
Okay. Is anyone up?
F1 term expires December 31st.
Right.
They approve the president. Brian Taylor, December 31st, 2016. When permanent DTJ alternate December 31st. Correct.
Yeah, so whomever you appoint to the alternate position is filling a role partially for this partial McConaughey seat. So he would be, they would be reappointed or be asked to be reappointed in December.
Well, I'd like to move that we appoint Eric Brown to the planning board seat and Steve Cockman as the town alternate.
Second.
motion by John Bonnet, seconded by Bette Wilson Foley. Is there further discussion? Those in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries.
Thank you, Board.
Thank you very much.
So what we still have left is one reappointment or a new appointment for an ETJ alternate. Wayne has indicated in the past, Wayne Hurton has indicated to me in the past few weeks that he's willing to serve. I've asked him to give me an application, and I haven't received anything yet. Maybe at the next meeting I'll have that. We'll have finally a full appointed board.
Until that time,
he still gets the packets, and he's still good to go. Yeah.
Jeff, a further question.
Yeah.
To the extent that you kind of administer and guide this board and at least help them convene, how do you feel about the suggestion that alternate, both in town and ETJ alternate members be encouraged to attend the meetings regardless, so that they are aware of the status of things?
Yeah, I find it to be of utmost importance, especially with all that we are going to have going on with continuing discussions on both UDO and Chatham Park related items. They need to hear, and it's good for them to hear. If they can't attend, we certainly could give them minutes or recordings for them to be able to listen, but I think you get a lot more flavor of the meeting itself when you move in.
Well, I think that's really the only way that they can be adequately prepared to fill in when called upon to fill in as alternates.
Right. There could be occasions where motion is delayed and someone who's at a board meeting this month might not be at the next one, and this new person, this alternate, was not at the prior meeting, and they're asked to make a decision, and they may not know all the information. So I've tried to tell the board members, try to make as many meetings as possible, even if you're a regular or an alternate member. And I'll relay that to Steve as well.
And I did submit that as part of my comments on the UDO, the section as regards to the planning board, but I wonder if the current board has been following this interchange with Jeff Jones and myself, if I could ask for a quick sense of consensus. Is the board similarly concerned about this, that alternate members of the planning board ought to be encouraged to attend even if they are not seated, attend all meetings? Thank you.
Is there an issue about payment? They don't get paid unless they sit at the front?
I'm not aware. I don't know
Or
how
if they attend as an alternate but don't make a decision?
I would have to defer to Brian.
It's only $10.
Right. I don't know what our board members get paid.
What do you get paid?
I think it's 25.
It's supposed to be
Never
25.
that. It's never really 25, but I think it's that. I think I get $69 and some cents for a month if I
Got it, $2 million.
something
Mr.
like
Grisbeck,
that.
are you referencing the budget to determine whether or not there's adequate funds?
Something like that.
No.
So I believe it's 25, Jeff. It would, you know.
I think Record would be right. 25.
You know, I don't know. I talk to folks about showing up, even here, but you know, I have the basis to require anybody to do a lot of stuff for free, or even for money.
It's largely a voluntary effort, but
So
I think I'm hearing from the board consensus that that is a priority for us, that we would ask if people are going to serve in an alternate capacity that they actually attend all meetings.
Yeah.
Thank you. Board member.
Thank you, Jeff Jones. The next thing on the agenda is the retreat agenda. You have received a copy of what is sort of a melded scheduling between Brian Grisbeck and myself, and let me just sort of, because of the late hour, let me just sort of cut to the immediate. The fact is that for years, and I've not been on here for years, but for years you all have met and you've done these priorities and you've done your strategic planning, and David Long has worked with you on. I was just trying to kind of mix it up a little bit. We don't have the opportunity to be able to talk about some of these subjects in depth, like hotel incentives or affordable housing, or long-range strategic master plans of utilities, or things like that, that it seems like we could really use some concentrated time and concentrated resources maybe. And so what we were looking at was trying to take the department head presentation into just a little bit over an hour. And the idea was that if we could have those presentations ahead of time, those bullet point presentations about what you achieved in each of the departments over the last year and what your goals for the next upcoming year are, without the kind of detailed practice, you have to tell us what already we would ostensibly know. And the budgetary part of it, I know that this is an important part for Heather and Brian to make fit all the budget pieces together, between getting those together. But Heather is not going to be available for this retreat. And so really, in a sense, the budgetary part of it, I don't know that we need to see it until it comes back to us in some sort of format later in the spring. Now, I may be wrong about that. Some of you may love looking at preliminary budget figures. Brian, do you have a thought about this?
We don't offer preliminary budget figures. We just kind of give a state of the budget at that point in time. So we're not doing any preliminary budget. When I describe it as that, it's more along the lines of getting an idea from the board on what your priorities are for the next year, as opposed to treating it as more of a workshop. Because if workshop to me is if you schedule something and call it a workshop, and you want to get in depth, as you say, or down into the weeds, as others might say, on specific issues like utilities or things of that nature. I think it's important to have a bit more of an idea of what you want to talk about with regards to utilities and with master planning and things of that nature, so we can have experts and professionals prepared to help answer those questions and actually give you some substance to the conversation. Aside from, Josh, it'd really be nice if we do a utilities master plan. Well, you can do that in pretty short order. I don't know that we need to take 4 hours in the afternoon to talk about that, as opposed to having actually going out and saying, going out and doing a PER on the water treatment system, the distribution and collection system, gathering that input and then actually having a professional come back and give you that input, I think would be more valuable than just sort of talking about it and spending 4 hours saying it would be nice if we had this information.
Well, one of the things that we've, and I know we'll all have an opportunity to do this later, because the additional elements coming in on affordable housing. Mayor Pro Tem Pamela Baldwin is serving on a committee that's dealing with affordable housing, and I think we're all really interested in that. Jim Nass has recently put together a group of resources, was it originally for your additional elements committee, that were things that came from Triangle J, things that came from different areas of the country that had resources that if you wanted to, we could lead down a pathway of some sort of structured brainstorming or identify topics or whatever. If we scoot down this thing, this plan, and end up at 10:30, that gives us a lot of time before lunch to talk about either a heady topic that we have not had an opportunity to get to in any detail, or we could go ahead and launch into the David Long definition of topics and strategic direction. So my impatience to get to some of the heady issues may be lurching or launching ahead too quickly, but please let me have some feedback with respect to this. I just don't want to leave next Monday without some degree of an action plan.
Well, I think, I mean, if you talk about, say, for instance, affordable housing, and we want to talk about the need for affordable housing, I think that's appropriate. And you want to include in that discussion some materials that we've collected and other people have collected over the last while, and I think that's great, but I don't know that, I mean, I guess without someone knowledgeable in the area of affordable housing to really help guide that discussion, I don't know how you get anything done there. I mean, you can say, I think we should focus more on affordable housing, and this is what I think we need to do to get there. I think that's a good conversation. But if we start talking about the actual meat and guts of affordable housing without having actually known anything about it, or if we don't have anyone at the table that really knows anything about it, then I don't know how we advance your goal of getting something done at that meeting. I think you're thinking one step ahead, maybe. You identify what are the things you want to focus on in this type of a discussion. You identify the things you want to focus on, and then you at the end of the meeting, where we talk about action planning, then you say, okay, we would like to see a workshop on affordable housing. We'll invite these people, and we'll spend a couple hours doing that by this date. And you know what I mean? That's what these identifying these goals and objectives leads you to later in the afternoon to actual action plans for concrete action. And then you get into the meat and you get into those discussions on some things without kind of spending the afternoon flailing around without anybody really knowing what we're talking about.
That may be the case, and I understand from a management perspective why you would certainly be saying that, Mr. Grusbeck. My own motivation in asking that we, as a board, carve out specific time for affordable housing during our retreat is that I think that there is a need, and probably we should make space for a heartfelt exploration of what it is that we feel the problem is and what we're willing to do for it. In very, very general terms, I don't think it's appropriate at this stage to talk about policies or measures or practices or tools or implementation. But I'd like us to, even if it's just 5 minutes, to sit down and face one another and say, is this important to us? How important is it? Why is it important? What general principles or goals or guidelines or sentiment can we express? Because I think it's really important at this point in time that we make a statement of sentiment. Non-binding resolution is a goal that I have. I would like this board to, within the near future, put something in writing describes our sentiments, not policy objectives.
Yeah, I think there's a way to do that. I think there's a way to accomplish all of that. I just want to caution. I just want to caution you all about trying to solve the world's problems in one day. And I'm not saying that's what you're suggesting that we do. I think there's a way to talk about those very issues in a little bit more depth, maybe than we have in other formats. Maybe than we have in other meetings in this type of a format. Especially if I'm able to pregame a little bit with Mr. Long and sort of say, okay, these are some of the things that we're going to want to focus on. Can you get the group there as quickly as possible?
There's an exercise that he has to do always. What ultimately, the whole purpose of it is to help us identify which issues we might want to work on and what we think are most important. Because that's the process. It's kind of like in some ways we're jumping ahead of, we're already determining that that's.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think if I'm giving you the impression that I think you're all wet, that's not what I'm trying to do. I'm just saying I think there's a way to accomplish that.
And I may be, but
no, I don't.
I think we already know that we are a team of 6 people who are really dedicated to affordable housing. And I think that being able to articulate that is going to be important. But maybe we can articulate that in the afternoon. What would the board like to do with that hour and a half if we did not have structured group brainstorming with identified topics? Would you like to start? I'll tell you my sense of frustration was that David Long we did this list of 20, and then we narrowed it to 10, and then we narrowed it to 5, and then we narrowed it to the top 30, and I felt like that was a lot of, thought we could move it quicker.
Yeah. I think you take that time period after the break, and you come up with, and you guys are already putting thought into it, so I think you're ahead of the game already. You come up with the things like the 5 or 6 things, maybe, or maybe it's 3 or 4, I don't know. It depends on how much time you want to spend on each one of them. But you come up with your list of affordable housing, with utility planning, with building space planning. You come up with a list of things, literally a handful of things you want to chew on after lunch, and then you start getting into. You take that 12:30 time, and you say, okay, we're going to bust these things out into these 4 or 5 different issue areas, and then we're going to identify what it is that we're concerned about within each one of those areas. So for affordable housing, what is it we want to focus on within affordable housing? A, B, C, D. And then at 3:30, you do that for each one of those 4 or 5 things, and then by 3:30 you roll around and you say, okay, how are we going to get these things done? These things that we talked about, how do we accomplish these things that we flushed out a little bit in the afternoon? And what kind of timelines are we putting on it? And so then by 4:30, you're ready to wrap up and get out of there, and we can start working on how, from a staff perspective, then we can start working on how we're looking at some of these larger issues, but also too that, and this is what I get back to when I originally started setting these up, and this what I tell the board every year is that from a budgeting perspective, this is where I don't want to confuse the issue with the budget. From a budgeting perspective, we have to decide, we have to figure out what you guys think is most important based on these discussions. Okay, so if I come in with a list of 20 items that department head wants to purchase, having an idea for what your priorities are, even in a broad and global sense, helps me narrow down some of those 20 items in order to plug that into the budget, present something to you that you guys can ultimately decide on in terms of, capital and operational spending over the next year. So I think maybe, Madam Mayor, I think your point is well made in that as opposed to coming up with 30 things, let's focus on maybe 5 or 6 or 7, and then we can whittle that down to 4 or 5, and then in the afternoon, we really action plan those 4 or 5 things out. I think there's a structured way to go about this.
So let's come on the process of what's on
So maybe David likes to do 9 items, maybe we do 5 items or 7.
We just cut them off.
And just, now David, we're going to change
Yeah.
our methodology. Still going to do the meeting, it's going to work. Well, I know. Commissioner Baldwin, to that point, going into this fairly new, last year, I thought I knew too, but the process that Mr. Long led us through, it was a very, very long list of things that, through discovery, through our conversation, wow, yes, those are priorities, and but my concern is that we not allow something that's really, really compelling and important as affordable housing to get lost among a very long list of very compelling items. And, I'm struggling with this because I'm privileged to live in a house. I'm comfortable, I'm confident I will have that house. Many people do not have this. I know I'm not telling anybody anything they don't already know. But it's easy to lose sight of that when we are addressing a very long list of very compelling public needs. And I hope that we can hang on to it long enough to get something. I would volunteer to write what it is that I'm describing, but I don't feel confident expressing the sentiment of each of you, because I think you all have different perspectives on the subject. But I just think that it's just absolutely critical that at this point in our growth, we put something on paper that describes how we feel, not what we're trying to do, not how we're going to do it, but how we feel about people's living situations in our community.
We definitely know that's one brainstorming point.
Good.
Yeah, no doubt.
I think that's one major one.
Well, I'm reassured by the suggestion that through conversations with Mr. Long.
I just think it's how we structure it, how we pregame it going into the conversation, and we just say, okay, let's get, the board clearly feels like it wants to spend a little bit more time on a more select list of priorities, as opposed to throwing everything but the kitchen sink at the wall, which I think works in some ways, in some arenas. I think now for what you guys want to do, maybe we need to be a little bit more focused, and I think that was the mayor's point all along, and I fully support that.
And I think Mr. Long is a skilled facilitator, and I think even if he doesn't specifically know about rural housing, he's very good about getting a dialogue going. So maybe that's all we need.
Yeah, I don't want to get too far down the path without having. Yeah.
Very good point. Maybe we'll want to do another meeting specific on affordable housing with.
That could be what you actually plan out. We want to have a workshop, affordable housing. We want to try and okay there. We want it.
Yeah, because I think you raised an excellent point. I think that's important. I can see this focus on something. This is going to be for us fleshing it out, and then I can see it being another meeting with people that you're talking about and really narrow this down a bit more.
I think Mr. Long was a great. He's one of the best showcase, and I've been in a lot of corporate America. I've been a lot of them, and he's just one of the best.
He creates a very good climate for. Yeah, I think we all agree that this is
Yeah, now it's the time. Jim Nash was telling me a story before we got our meeting started this morning, this afternoon. Feels like it's been 24 hours. About a community that had not done what I hope we're going to do, which is to set out goals and how we're going to get there and create pods, create plans and all of that. And they hadn't done it. And so what happened when they proposed affordable housing was the whole community went up in arms because they weren't prepared for the variety, for the compelling nature of it, and it just fell flat, right, Jim? And he was just saying what a shame that was because if the proper planning and proper foundation is right, then we're all just 100% ready.
And I want to throw just a little seed out to people also be thinking about part of affordable housing, which I'm pretty sure was average age was quite high, especially in the 40s or 50s. We have an aging population, and one thing we want to think about is whatever it's expensive. Let me tell you, I'm worried because I'm not going to have affordable. My parents are doing it. If I ever need that, and I think that's another piece that we need to think about is having the unaffordable baby boomers that are getting older, and also just because they're just going to end up having to do things. And so we need to look at that piece of the deal. Okay.
So I think we've got our direction. So, Brian Brusack, we've got
Yes, thank you.
update here.
I'm not going to, you guys have it in writing there. If you want to take the time to read it, go ahead and read it. If you have any questions on it, let me know. But otherwise, I just won't say anything else about it.
We also have a memo about utilities, and I think, I don't know how many people, oh yes, we did go. There was went to the board. Josh Cricker has a daughter that lives in Pittsburgh with 2 children. He wrote a very compelling email about why he thought we ought to consider a hardship policy. Yeah, we do, and that's shown as a FYI, which just looked out here. And Heather has provided that for us. I think what he's asking for is a little bit different, but that's another piece of law. Okay, so does that leave us into Commissioner's concerns? Excellent. Jay Farrell.
I just have one thing. I spoke to Brian last week. Something that's kind of, as we move through all this, the Shadow Park and all the development, the underground water, the water tank, the reclamation plant, and all like this, I'm really hope the board will get maybe behind us. I would like to get us involved with hydrostructure more. At least get them to review plans, review drawings, and make sure and help Fred out. Because I think we need more eyes on this. We got a lot coming up underground. They're here. They don't have to drive from Hillsborough or wherever our other contractors are. We have the money, and I hope in our budget from Chatham Park, $300,000. I know it's not to that, but I hope we have money to use that. And that's the way I feel about it. No conflict on staff or nothing, Fred, but I'm sure your hands are full. But I think we need the help from infrastructure. And I hope that we can move forward and get in some plans. And I know they're doing work for us now, but they may have more work than they can do. I don't know. That's something I want to check into. That's all I have.
I was contacted by 2 people this week. One was just throwing out that if a sidewalk to be considered in the future would be one going
Which segment?
From the intersection of Highway 64 and 87 over there, the diner.
There is sidewalk there is sidewalk on the east side of the street.
Yeah, the one that goes all the way to the library.
He goes to the library.
He goes to the library.
You cross at the circle there.
It isn't on the west side.
There's a crosswalk right there at the traffic circle over.
I think that's the concern, is that it's not on the west side of the street.
It's only money.
Or either way, it's still
Another
across the
comment
street.
about was something I mentioned earlier about, and this could be if I have to, is when you're traveling on 64, whether you're coming east or west, the green signs say Carthage and Sanford, not Pittsburgh. And you're right there. It should say Pittsburgh. And I know there's a brown sign that says Historic Pittsburgh, but we should be on the green signs. And I don't know what we need to do to get Pittsburgh on that exit sign. And I think as we grow, we have hotels and restaurants and all these things, if we can get more people off the highway and stopping in, that's a good thing. And I don't know why the little Carthage is over this. It's pretty late. How do you do that?
Who's the rep, Madam Mayor, to the RPO? Is it Michael? Who's the current rep for the town of the Rural Planning Organization? No town member? That would need to go to the Rural Planning Organization and bring it up to their, if Jeff's going there for the staff, the RTCC, and start through there. That's how we got the unique shop sign done. You go through the process of the Rural Planning Organization, and then it'll send it up to the appropriate DOT board. So you just need to originate it there.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Michael? My comments. I checked about a week and a half ago. I didn't get a chance to check today, but this evening the comments from the town are appearing regarding the UDO are appearing on the UDO website. That's about that. One thought it was a good idea. The rest of the community can see what others were thinking about. So I don't know if it's on there. If we can double check and remind Mr. Walden. Yeah. The other thing, and I've actually several folks say that they're enjoying the sidewalks so much along the street that they wish that it was lit. About one of the street lights stop. Might be at I don't even know where.
The new sidewalk over here?
Yeah, people are really using it a lot, and so it's like if they have some lights to walk by, they feel safe.
Yeah, Mr. Grusbeck and I spoke about, well, we're going to have a sidebar conversation about the crosswalks situation, accessibility from the north side of West Street to get over to Pittsburgh Elementary School, and we'll do that. But there's another thing. Yes. Again, I'd like to request a prospective, advanced, tentative agenda to understand what we have coming down the pike at us a month out, 2 months out, etc.
And I got a form that goes through the process of that, and I've been trying to sort of keep track of it tonight about future agendas. But apparently, this is something that you suggested years ago.
And we actually did have a thing called a look ahead.
Look ahead. There we go.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, as I said, Mr. Terry used to include it in his packets, but they were updated very sporadically. And even so, it's not going to always get at the really sexy issues that you probably are wanting to be most involved with knowing about ahead of time. They're going to be very basic. Like if you looked at, I'm sure that's Bill Perry's list that he probably gave you. So if you look at it, after a while it tends to be financial report, minutes.
I did think it could have been more useful.
And so with the size of the packets being so big, it was, I mean, if you look at how many pages there did he give you when he gave it to you, it was probably pretty good size. So I would rather, I mean, rather than putting that in a packet every week, I'd rather put that on an electronic site where you guys can access it. But if you don't want to do that, then yeah, we can put it in the packet every week. Then I would just recommend maybe not going out 6 months in advance or something, because I don't know how meaningful that's going to be anyway.
Weren't we doing that with Evernote for a little while?
Yeah, but I didn't get much traffic with it, so I stopped doing it. You know, I still use Evernote for just about everything. But
I think that'd be a nice thing to have on the website, like upcoming public hearings and things like that.
yeah, and public hearings are noticed in advance, so I mean, you know about those things ahead of time. But I mean, you know, saying that okay, we're going to discuss, say, the Sanford agreement on such and such a date. Well, sometimes we don't end up discussing it on that date. It gets put off a week. You know, I mean, so these things, you know, agendas oftentimes, you know, a lot of the issues that you see on agendas outside of the scheduling of public hearings and regular things like financial reports and things like that are often quite fluid. So you're going to come up with these sort of rote, you know, documents from time to time that really don't tell you much. After a while, you're going to stop paying attention to it. But yeah, we can work on having something maybe that's a little bit more revelatory than what we have now.
It'd be good if you're intending to ask this board to give final approval on a contract that's 30 years in duration with possibly extensions to 90 years. It'd be really good to have more than 48 hours notice.
Or maybe 5 times you've discussed it since August.
Understand we've continued to discuss it. That's very important.
Right.
If it's the final review that you're requesting, better than 48 hours is good.
You've discussed it 5 times.
I think you described that draft as the final version.
After the board directed Mr. Messick to approach Sanford with
Mr. Rusbeck, this is a policy board. It seems to me that if you would like the whole support of the board, that it would be a good idea to be sensitive to even one person who objects to the pace of a major initiative. Thank you.
One thing we have not discussed tonight is the review by Robert Epting of the Sanford Force Main contract. Paul Messick, have you gotten any idea of when those comments are headed our way?
He promised last Thursday.
All right. Perhaps we'll have those in time for. He talked to me about it on the phone the other day, and there's one sort of overriding issue that he sees as important to discuss, and we might even be able to pick that up at the retreat, just to introduce it as a potential idea. So I'd like to second the idea that anything that we can do for a more walkable community. I didn't realize it, but the other day my statistician daughter told me that there is a higher value for property and land in homes that have a higher grade of walkability, and she had some interesting strategies about how to improve that in our community, and so we might want to talk about that at some point. But I had no idea that was a criteria that's used by appraisal companies and people like Zillow to, the higher your score on walkability, the higher your value. I thought that was
what Paul Ford was saying about that's what people want now more than golf courses and everything. They want that walkability.
I'd like to, weigh in on a couple of things because I am concerned about this. And John, I'm concerned about the idea that you were unaware that there was a request for final action or that was an option from the contract. Because I think the agenda clearly stated that. And so I was prepared. I took extra time, did what I had to do. So so I don't think it's fair to suggest that it was unbeknownst to you or to any of the board members. The other thing I'm really quite concerned about is the fact that we've spent time, energy, resources getting an attorney to review something that, if in fact Sanford accepts, they have voted to approve it with language. We've sent it back to them with language. If they accept it, it's a contract. And so I've always been a little confused and concerned about getting Bob Epstein involved. And so I just want to let everybody know that I have that concern because I'm not sure exactly what to do with that information after the fact. And I'm very concerned about the appearances and in fact, the reality of what it portends and what it may be interpreted by others. I'm very concerned about it. We have voted to approve it with changes to the language, and the next day it went off to Sanford. And so I don't know where they stand with it, but there's a real opportunity that if they accept the language as is, it's a binding contract.
Brian Griesbeck and I talked about it shortly after all of that, and we agreed that having another set of eyes look at this was not a bad thing. The people who had looked at it already had very, very vested interest, and it was a lovely cooperative look that Paul Mesnick and Bob Epstein, who have worked together for years, were willing to put forth this, and it was it's not going to be terribly expensive. It's not going to be anything, considering the value of the Force Main line to Sanford and considering the term of the project, it seemed as though having another look at it was not an unreasonable thing to do. So that did not seem to require anything other than just our conversation. Is that true, Brian Griesbeck, from the standpoint of authorizing that to occur? And in the meantime, Sanford has come back to questions about some of the things that were put in the contract as the last draft. So I don't think what your fear is going to come to fruition. I think they've still got some questions floating back and forth.
No, aside from that, Commissioner Fiocco is correct. The agreement was voted 4-1 for approval with corrections. I don't disagree that another review of it, aside from the two attorneys that have already looked at it, in addition to staff and other paid consultants, is a bad thing. I don't disagree with that either. I don't think it was 100% necessary, to be honest, but I don't think it was bad either. But I do take umbrage with the notion that this was forced upon the board, especially after the board voted relatively decisively on it, and especially after discussion following the closed session on November 14th, 2016, came up with 5 items that the board was to take to Sanford, and if Sanford approved, we had an agreement. That was not a surprise. Back in November, this agreement was not a surprise to you as late as January 23rd. So I apologize if anyone felt that way, but there was certainly no intention to hurry this agreement along. And obviously, we're not hurrying along. There still is more review of it. There still is more time that we can take to it. But yeah, it is something I think that process-wise, in terms of the overall project, we need to keep moving forward on it, one way, shape, or form. And so we'll know a little bit more, I think, by the end of this week.
Commissioner Fiocco, to your point, recent practice and my preferred experience is to receive the packet on Thursday evening. We received it on Saturday. I was, for personal reasons, unable to review it until Sunday. I cannot make adequate connections with people I need to make connections with in basically 24 hours. And I received apologies from 2 other board members who agreed that we were rushed. So there is a sentiment that we were rushed. So whether that sentiment is shared universally is in my opinion, it's indicative of a problem. If we're going to do something as important as a 90-year agreement, a permanent, unbreakable agreement, then we should be unanimous. Please, I hope. I am not trying to block this project. I've already agreed and said multiple times I believe that it's necessary. I wanted to make sure we were doing everything correct.
Well, John, I would appreciate unanimous as well. Certainly would. But at the end of the day, it's important enough. And every decision we make up here as a group is not going to be unanimous. And it is going to be equally as important because it will affect everybody's lives. It affects people's lives. Every decision we make here affects people's lives. So we do the best that we can to be prepared. We won't always be exactly right. There will always be mistakes. There will always be errors. We'll be second guessing. But we went through a process, and it was a rigorous one. And it came time that I felt we were ready to vote. And I put the motion forward, and I didn't rush anybody. And it was second, and it was a vote of 4-1. I wish you had come along as well, but you didn't. And for that, I'm not suggesting that we stop and that the one vote outrule the 4. I'm not either. So, the fact is, we are now spending additional resources. We should have done that prior to the vote. I agree. And I suggested this several times. But, at the same time, I've got paperwork from 2004 talking about the need for sewer. I think there were people in this room that ran on that campaign, not only sitting up on this board. And we recognized it as an urgent need for over a decade. And there was a lot of due diligence done. There was a tremendous amount of resources and energy put into analysis, quantifying risk, and understanding it. And quite frankly, I thought we had gone through a proper process to get to the point where we were ready to make a decision. I don't recall it coming on Saturday being, an issue, and I trust I get frustrated if it comes on Saturday as well, because I would prefer Thursday, Friday, Monday, to get access to folks. But quite frankly, I thought we had gone through a very rigorous process and reached a point at which we were ready for a decision.
So I say with the final contract, we actually had time to make that decision and everything was possible. I was out of town that week, and I didn't get my packet, so I got that one before. So that is a process. You're out of town, and you get to a little fun. But,
well, I had the same issue today.
I think we get a final contract. I worked on it more than one time. I didn't want to hold up the process, so I voted for it. But I didn't feel entirely comfortable because I didn't feel thoroughly about the contract. The final contract that was really very impactful. I needed something like people have to.
I don't know if we're going to get that from another attorney's perspective.
Well, I will say this, and I thought that everyone was comfortable in making that decision But to me, this is an afterthought. All of these things should have been said before, in addition to, I know you were unready, but if anyone else was unready at that vote, that should have been made before, and not after saying we need another set of eyes. Because a lot of times, when we do that, that makes your partners who you're trying to work with wonder, well, why are they sort of flip-flopping on what we're doing? We've made we have made a decision, and we need to stick with it. Of course, we're going to stick with that decision, but to have to go back and have another attorney look at it after the fact, and that gives a pretty bad impression as to does the board really know what they want to do. So it would be better to have this type of discussion before, even if you were unready and didn't want to hold up the process. We could have held the process. That would have been fine. It wouldn't have been a problem with that. But, oftentimes, sometimes as a board, you have to stand alone. When I was the only one sitting here, none of you all were here. I stood alone. There's the mayor back there. He can tell you, the former mayor. I did stand alone. And, there was nobody to necessarily support me in what I was saying, which is fine. Sometimes you have to stand alone. But if there's any unreadiness about a vote that we're about to take or make a major decision, I think we need to make that known then before we go to the vote. Let's say what we feel. If we're unready or if there's a problem, we need to just let our town manager know and our attorney know that we have a situation and let each other know. So that way we can go on and resolve it before we take the next step.
I wholeheartedly agree with that communication, plea for communication, because I think it makes us a better board, it makes our decisions better, and I wholeheartedly agree. Are we ready to adjourn? Is there a motion?